The maths mission, are we like the primary unit this year, or?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, as you might recall, it rotates every month. So there'll be 1, 2, 3, or 4 month to month. And I think in June we start as number 2. So we'll probably rotate to number 1 in July, but I didn't look at the schedule that carefully. But they're not number 1 for the entire fire season. It rotates.
Onward, Colonel.
All right, sir. Army Guard deployment. So I talked a little bit about G Company, which is Army Aviation. Those are your Black Hawk helicopters. They already left in January. You might have seen some of the press releases for that. Det 6 individuals, think medical folks, and they're from mainly Cheyenne. They pull a lot of people from northern Colorado as well, and they are about to deploy. I want to say this coming weekend. I could be wrong. And then we get into the field artillery deployments, which is really the bulk of the people. The 2nd of the 300th deploys 120 in May, and they're really based out of Sheridan, although they pull folks from all over Wyoming and multiple other states. The 115th Field Artillery Brigade, that's what BDE stands for, deploys 92 soldiers in July. And those deployments are generally 9 or 10 months on the Army side. And then we have the Target Acquisition Platoon, which deploys 23 folks in July, and they are located in Cheyenne. And then finally, the 2nd of the 300th, the second phase, deploys an additional 30 soldiers in September. So as you can see, this year it's really the Army Guard's year to shine as they deploy hundreds of troops, some 300 plus or minus. In terms of projects around the state of importance, the Regional Training Institute, which is basically a classroom building up at Camp Guernsey. If you've been up there or by Guernsey, it's about 85% complete. It basically looks like a done building. It's right on the, kind of on the right-hand side as you go into the cantonment area, the building area.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Anderson.
I have a question on the deployments. Can you tell us where those deployments are? That one for 120 soldiers in May was in Casper, and that was really a interesting deployment. Can you tell us where those others are that we might be able to make it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, my understanding is the July deployments will be in Cheyenne. And I am not sure about the September deployment. But we can certainly get that out to the committee, because we very much appreciate the support of this committee and the legislature. We've had numerous representatives and senators at our deployment ceremonies, and it's very appreciated. But we will get that out to you all, sir.
Thank you.
The other major project was the Laramie Readiness Center, what we now call our armories. It's 99% complete, and we're trying to schedule a ribbon cutting for next month. So that too will go out to the legislature, is my understanding. In terms of the rest of the military department, obviously we're very much tracking the flood posture in the state, working with WOES. Just was in a briefing last week. So far the snowpack in most areas looks like it's about normal, a little higher than normal around Saratoga. And then of course up in the northeast part of the state, the reservoirs are very full because they've been holding water because of all the flooding downstream in Nebraska. But so far the experts tell us it looks okay, as long as we don't have a major rain event. The other thing to report to the committee is the Wyoming Cowboy Challenge Academy is now fully accredited. It's built into the Department of Education system as an alternate school location, kind of like the Cathedral Home and the Boys and Girls Schools. So, and the current class has 66. They are really pushing to 100 cadets. And I think the next class, that is their goal. So that is the optimum number of folks in the facility.
Colonel Smith, is that 3 times a year or twice a year?
Mr. Chairman, it is down to the twice a year model, which is the national model. As members of this committee last year may recall, the federal government gave us additional money to cut from the 4-start model we were using thanks to the legislative efforts. And we went back to the national model, which is 2 starts a year, which is really better for the program because the 4 starts a year gives the staff no time off, basically. They're constantly going from class to class to class, which obviously when you're dealing with high school age children, of which I've had a few, going from no break as an employee is a tough thing. So the two-class model is looking good. We're hoping to have the same number of cadets graduate throughput-wise despite going to two classes. So the idea is to have two classes fuller than the four classes. And I will say, I heard from some of the recruiters a couple of weeks ago, and they are really pushing hard to get to that 100 cadet number. So we're looking forward to that. We had a Wyoming Welcome Home Day, and if there's any questions about that, Mr. Kravitsky knows more about it than I do. The Wyoming National Guard did celebrate the Guard's 149th birthday in April, so 150 next year, so that'll be interesting. And the last thing was one of the programs of international importance, the Joint Military Commission, our state partner under the Department of State's State Partnership Program is the country of Tunisia on the northern side of Africa, right south of Italy. And the Joint Military Commission occurs every year. This, I think, was the 33rd year of it. Typically, it's in D.C., and for the first time, they were invited for part of it to come to Cheyenne, to Wyoming. And we had the Tunisian ambassador to the United States was there. Various State Department officials, including an undersecretary, was in Cheyenne. Toured them around, talked to them about what we do, showed them at least the Cheyenne area. And it was a great event. Met some very interesting people. They have a very different rank structure. I think their 1 stars are senior colonels. And people call me a senior colonel because I'm old, but I'm not a general. So it was a very interesting event, and that was the first time, and all of them walked away wanting to do it again, to come to Cheyenne.
Colonel Smith, one moment here, Senator Pappas.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, first time I heard of this is when I got the letter from the retiree letter, and so I was a little. You might want to pass on to General Porter that in the past when things like that happened, we brought the Tunisian delegation here. There were events available to be able to meet these folks, the public, or certainly folks that get involved in it. So I didn't know about it. I would have loved to, like, welcome them to the city, and I just think that the military department needs to do a better job of bringing us into the mix when they're in town. I think it was a big deal, and I didn't know anything about it. So pass that on, please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, yes, sir, it was one of our after-action comments. We didn't control this event very much. This was really controlled from D.C., and they limited the numbers of people to most of the events. I don't know why, but it was one of the strongest after-action comments that we had a number of civic leaders who would have enjoyed talking to the Tunisians. So it was, they probably won't do this next year, but they're talking the year after, 2021, doing this kind of every other year, because it is a little bit of a logistical nightmare for the State Department folks, moving it from where they're normally. But we will take that back, and I will talk about it with General Porter.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So anyhow, I know they've been here in the past when I was in, and they came like during Frontier Days, and there were a lot of community events that we did, and I think it builds a great rapport between the state and the Tunisians, especially the Tunisian military folks that we work with a lot on that side. So yeah, I would just, whoever, if you're going to follow up with the folks in D.C., just pass on our thoughts.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, I will. I appreciate that. And one update, the next deployment ceremony for the Army Guard is actually in Afton on the 28th of May, and then the Cheyenne deployment ceremony will be 29 July, and that will be in Cheyenne.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator.
I'm reading this, 149th birthday for the Wyoming National Guards. Is that 1870, and what did they do? Were they called Wyoming at that time before the state?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, perhaps poor verbiage. It is the United States National Guard's birthday. It wasn't the Wyoming. Wyoming National Guard does not predate the state. But it's a good catch.
Good catch on that. Colonel Smith?
Well, sir, with that, that's your military update, pending any further questions from the committee.
Senator Anderson, do you have something?
No, sir.
And Colonel Smith, who's cataloging military history.
Members of the committee, for the record, I'm Steve Kravitsky, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Veterans Commission. I believe out of the Management Council, there was a study requested to catalog military and veterans history, artifacts, and attractions located throughout the state and its state property and facilities. I think we need to define the scope of this. I can tell you right now, owning the two museums, the Wyoming Veterans Military Museum and the National Guard Museum, we have about 50,000 artifacts in the Wyoming Veterans Military Museum and 100,000 artifacts in the National Guard Museum, of which about 50% are cataloged in the Past Perfect database. So I'm not sure if you want to get to that level of fidelity of every artifact, or if you're more looking for the facilities around the state, like the Wyoming Veterans Military Museum, the National Guard Museum, armory displays that we have throughout various armories in the state, upcoming museums such as the military vehicle museums that's going to be opening up in Du Bois in probably about another year or so. Memorial parks such as the one in Cody and Pine Bluffs, statues and other attractions.
So, Mr. Kavinsky, I think that Representative McGuire had shown me some stuff that was in Casper that could possibly be included that is not in your digest at the moment. Could you elaborate on that, Representative?
Well, I would just point out, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Use the microphone if you would, please.
Just point out, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, that the Casper Army Air Base, which was built in 1942, is one of the best preserved and last remaining of the 12 training bases that were built during World War II. And so I know that there is interest in trying to expand the Military Veterans Museum to incorporate some portions of the air base and to preserve some portions of the air base, specifically Hangar 1, which would be an opportune, it's a well-preserved hangar, and we've got an opportunity right now. There's a window of opportunity to preserve that hangar and keep it open for the public. So that would be something that may be of interest to the committee.
So, Representative McGuire, are we going to take this up mostly when we meet in Casper, which would be, we're going to Cheyenne next and we're going to Casper after that. Should we then take up the museum piece of that?
Certainly we can. It would be our pleasure in Casper to take everyone for a tour, show them not only the museum facility, but also around the Casper Airport, Hangar 1, and then also there's a rail spur that's adjacent to the Casper Airport, which would be good to take a look at how that is growing, and also discuss the new free trade zone that covers Natrona County and how that can help to benefit the state.
Mr. Kavinsky, you're correct in that we need to identify what we're after. I think there is some things on the Casper Airport that could be included in yours, but I don't know that there's legislation that needs to be developed around this, unless you may know something I don't.
Mr. Chairman, currently the Wyoming Veterans Military Museum is on that property, as you all know, at the Natrona County Airport in the old Army Air Base training field. And we're having a meeting next week with some of the representatives from Natrona County to discuss this, and I've had conversations with Representative McGuire in the past on this. So it is on our radar scope, but there's a lot of questions I think that we need to have answered. If this facility does come under the purview of the Veterans Commission, can we do it with the current manpower we have, with the current funding we have? That building, I think, needs to be renovated, and I think Representative McGuire could speak more to that than I can. But we only have, for both museums, 2 state employees. In Cheyenne, we're running the National Guard Museum purely on volunteers. Hangar 1 is it's an incredible facility. I've been in there several times with Representative McGuire. It's just the history and heritage of that specific hangar it's incredible if you haven't seen it. I just don't know how we would take that over without some kind of personnel and budgetary tail that would go with the operations of that facility with the current resources we have.
So, Mr. Co-Chair.
So when we were at the Management Council meeting, it was my understanding that we would just catalog the military attractions in different places, not necessarily do anything to change them, but it would be kind of a tourist, I thought, brochure so that military buffs could come and grab that brochure. We have a command center outside of Cheyenne that'll be turned into a state park, is currently being done now. Other things around the state. It would just, I think, just be an advertisement for it. It wouldn't require much more responsibility than a list of what's available and what's there. Do you think that'd be pretty burdensome to do that, or should we change?
No, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think we could certainly do that. We can work with Parks and Cultural Resources and get a listing of all the attractions throughout the state, working with veteran service organizations. I mean, if you've been to Cody, they have an absolutely beautiful Veterans Memorial Park there. Pine Bluffs has another one. There are little pockets around the state that celebrate the history and heritage of our military, and I think we can absolutely get that done.
I think your recommendation, Mr. Kavinsky, is the research and provide a listing of military museums, memorial parks, displays, and attractions throughout Wyoming with a military nexus. And I believe that is what our charge is. I could be mistaken on this, but Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I think it says military history too. And I was hoping that we would get Fort Steele, Fort Phil Kearny, and I think you'll get that all from the parks. But I think we need to do the military cemetery also. That's one of our facilities also. But in the military history, I think we ought to go back to 1892 when the military came out of Fort McKinney there in Buffalo and saved the invaders who had already murdered 2 people and maybe saved them from murdering more people.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Anderson, we could certainly go back to 1892 and collect and collate all the information.
So this would be not only the military artifacts that are existing today or from World War II on, but would be the whole history of the state of Wyoming is what you want. Yeah, okay.
And Mr. Chairman, I believe we can certainly do that within this session.
And so will you have something in December, or November, whenever our last meeting is, that would just be an outline of the brochure listing everything?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would work with Parks and Cultural Resources to get a brochure going, but what I will do between now and then, if it meets with your approval, is I'll start getting a listing of all these facilities around the state, these attractions, Fort McKinney. They're just little pockets. Quebec 1 is what you're referring to, Mr. Co-Chairman, the missile alert facility for the Peacekeeper weapon system. I don't think that would be a monumental lift at all, and I think we can get that done. But I'm going to put our Mr. John Woodward, the director of our museums, on this, and he'll work with the Parks and Cultural Resources, and I think this is a fairly easy lift.
So you'll be on the agenda on our last meeting, so you can give us the list, and hopefully some outline of the brochure would be great to have too, so we'll see how that goes.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion on the museum part of this? A review of statutory updates needed related to military matters.
Mr. Chairman, so on the slide on page 7 of your slides, this is always the catch-all. We've done this the last few years. And we identified 5 potential areas within Title 19 and other related statutes that having to do with military and veterans affairs. And they are listed here on this slide, and then the subsequent slides will go through each one. So the 5 statutes we wanted to look at to see if there was any revision necessary. The first one was 19-7-106, which concerned the Office of the State Judge Advocate, yes, my job, whether or not to allow a civilian or non-military employee to fill the post. And I'll just review the 5, and then we'll go on to subsequent slides and talk in detail about each one, if I may. The second one was whether the Veterans Property Tax Exemption, which is in 39-13-105, needed to add newer qualifying metals, campaigns, and such, and we'll talk about that. Number 3 was to review and clarify the status and immunities of the Air National Guard state security officers, and I'll explain that to you when we get there. Number 4 was something that came up from the Starbase Academy Foundation, and that was considering adding statutory authority for the Wyoming Military Department to accept donations for both Starbase and the Cowboy Challenge. And I'll tell you what the issue is, the legal issue that we're trying to address. And finally, the 5th was, there was an idea floated from within our recruiting and retention folks about the state tuition program in dealing with ROTC cadets at the University of Wyoming who want to opt into the tuition program, and one of the reasons they're not. So we'll talk about that, and that one's a little complicated. But if y'all would flip over to the next page, which is slide 8. So the first one was the Office of the State Judge Advocate. Currently, the statute requires that the person shall be an active member of the Air or Army National Guard. We were concerned with this really because there was newer DOD policy that was attempting to remove uniform members from non-deployable positions. And this position is non-deployable. It's a headquarters position. It's not against any deployable UTC or unit task code. In looking at it, we determined that we really could convert a full-time position to a federal civilian and still appoint a military member to fulfill the limited functions of that office by statute. So really, our recommendation after our study was no actions really necessary. We're mindful of going into a budget session. If something comes up between now and then policy-wise that drives something different, we certainly will bring that back up as an interim topic, hopefully for the 2021 session.
Colonel Smith, does this mean an active member? The definition today is somebody that's deployable or not?
Mr. Chairman, an active member means somebody in uniform. So somebody who's a current member of the Guard. Doesn't matter about deployability. But the move by the military, as some of you may have read nationally in the papers, has been to really become more of a lethal force. And a lot of the support functions, they've been transitioning to civilians. And certainly the head lawyer for the military department does not have to be a uniform member, because we have 5 Army Guard traditional M-Day part-time attorneys, and we have 3 other Air Guard traditional part-time attorneys already in our ranks to fulfill any deployment requirement. So really this doesn't limit our federal mission at all, and that's why we wanted to look at it. But they've really walked back a little bit of the transition to these non-deployable positions being not uniformed. And so really, it's an unsettled area right now. Nationally, the Air Guard has yet to put out a policy on what they're going to do with it. The Army Guard's policy became less than we expected. It's not as rigorous as we assumed. So we think it's a wait-and-see attitude is really the best thing to do at this point. So that's our recommendation to the committee. We self-appointed an interim topic, we studied it, and we don't want you to take any action.
We appreciate that.
I thought you might, Mr.
In
Chairman.
fact, that's our best. We don't take any action.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Was that a committee decision, or was that just one person's decision?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, that was our recommendation to the committee, and I will certainly stand for the committee's action.
Senator Anderson, do you want to make a motion that we do?
Well, it looks to me like it's moving to eliminate that position, so I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, I
Colonel
appreciate Senator Anderson's humor. I enjoy my paycheck, just to be personal about it. So our recommendation before the committee is that we drop this from our interim topics and we won't discuss it in the next few meetings unless the committee wants us to further study.
So Colonel Smith, what I think you are doing is the state judge advocate and state's position shall remain as is.
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's a statute, it's one of the 5 military department statutory required positions. It's really not quite 5 anymore because we changed some of the assistant adjutant general positions. But yet, really the function of that job by statute is to appoint other judge advocates within the ranks. That's really their number one job by statute. And we can certainly, we don't have any problem keeping that, meeting the statutory requirement, which is why we just don't see there's a change necessary at this time.
And it's nothing the Department of Defense wants?
No, sir, we've had nothing concrete about that. And as I mentioned, the policy about these non-deployable positions, since some of the leadership, especially in the Army, has retired, it's in a state of transition. The people who are really pushing for some of these positions to go civilian are now no longer in the department. So we're kind of a wait and see.
Any further discussion on state judge advocate? Seeing none, please.
Mr. Chairman, it's very uncomfortable to talk about my job. Moving number 2, this was the veterans property tax exemption and 3913-105. And this was brought to us during last session, just a question on whether or not certain named operations and certain awards are comprehensive enough for all of the different operations and campaigns that the military has been involved with in the last several years. The statute hasn't been revised in over 10 years. What this legislature did previously, though, is they adopted Section A, small Roman numeral 6, which was really the catch-all back when we took the last action 10 years ago, which allowed the veterans property tax exemption to include all honorably discharged veterans with expeditionary medal or other authorized service or campaign medal. And we looked at that and we could not come up with a fact pattern with the enduring freedom in Afghanistan, Iraqi freedom, the Kosovo operation. Everything seemed to fit that catch-all provision, even though the statute names a number of campaigns, specifically like World War II and Korea and Vietnam. So at this point, we were asked to look at it, and we think the provision as it stands is adequate for all of the things our Wyoming citizens have been part of in the last 20 years. And so again, our recommendation after study is that no further action is required. We believe that catch-all provision is adequate for all of the campaigns and military operations overseas that this is really looking at.
So the A6, the A Romanet 6, was put in 10 years ago approximately?
Roughly, it was added.
I think we were trying to make sure we covered everything we finally just said. This general blanket comment will cover everybody from this point onward too.
Mr. Chairman, this property tax exemption, what kind of value do they place on those medals?
So you had to get up to, is it $1,500? For up to $3,000 in a property tax exemption, you have to be an honorably discharged veteran. You have to prove overseas service in really combat operations. And basically 1 through 5 is certain named things like World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And A6 was added for things like Enduring Freedom, Iraqi freedom, some of the, Desert Storm 1 and 2. So you have to show a campaign medal or something else showing an overseas combat operation service, and you apply in your county for the veterans property tax exemption. The medals have no value. The medals prove the service that gives you the property tax exemption.
So,
Mr. Chairman.
Representative, or Senator Hutchings, sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Smith, I think what Mr. Anderson may want to know also is that this information is on your DD 214, the campaigns you've been involved in, and that's what you used to get the exemption.
And, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchins, that's absolutely right. That is another way, because your DD 214, when you complete your federal service, it lists all of the operations you were part of, supposed to, and all the campaign medals that you participate in, and that becomes the source document the counties have been using for years to, when you apply for the Veterans Property Tax exemption.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, my question was wrong. I thought the exemption was for the metals, but not for, just for the property. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, I faced this with a guardsman who was not able to get the exception. I think it was a year or two ago, because it was not shown on the DD 214. They had, you probably know the officer that had this issue, and it was not put on. I mean, they screwed it up in D.C. or somewhere, and it took forever to get it to show up, and so this officer lost out on 1 year's exemption. Is there something we can fix in the statute that we don't have to wait on D.C. to do that? I mean, can we tweak it so that somebody else doesn't fall into this?
Mr. Chairman, Senator
Mr.
Pappas,
Kravinsky.
I just dealt with this about 2 months ago. I had a veteran who had a DD 214 that wasn't updated for the service. This is a service issue, not updating the DD 214 in a timely manner. I think when the individual who was in the Guard pulled up his information through the Air Force Personnel Center, it showed the award of the medal in his documentation. So I think if the statute was modified to say either the DD 214 or some other proof through the service, that would alleviate a lot of the problems we have, because and Senator Pappas hit it right on the head, Mr. Chairman. The biggest problem we have right now isn't the fact that the veteran earned the medal or the expeditionary medal or the campaign medal. It's the fact that it takes the services a long time to update their DD Form 214 with that information.
So, Mr. Gravinsky, is this something we need to do as far as statute to change and say other proof?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we need to change it to some other qualifying service-related document that will show that the veteran had received that medal.
Representative Western, you have something to say? Two seconds.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said that it takes a while for them to update the DD 214. Are we talking months, years? What's the kind of time frame, generally speaking, if you had to estimate?
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Western, the simple answer to your question is it depends. I've seen DD 214s updated within a month, and I've seen DD 14s that were sent back to the veteran that had errors that takes over a year to update. So it really depends on the individual processing that either the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. I can't give you a solid answer. I can tell you when I retired from active duty service, it took them 4 shots to get my DD 214 correct with my qualifications, my medals, and I was a base commander, okay? So it's just, the answer is it depends. There are errors on those constantly. I just had another issue last week with a veteran trying to apply for a fishing license. It's the same thing. The letter from the VA stated that he was 50% service-connected disabled, but it didn't say compensated. Well, if you're 50% service-connected disabled, you're automatically compensated for that. So there's other things that we deal with as well. But right now, the DD 214 is the central document that's used across the United States for veterans' benefits. Whether it's VA, I will tell you that most states use that DD 214 as the core document for benefits.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative, I think Representative Brown has something for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess maybe another question to look at this, because I had brought something very similar to this to you guys last year. Is this maybe more of an outreach effort that we can do with our county treasurers and assessors, as opposed to changing statute, to look at this as we can clearly tell that there's a backlog or whatever the case may be, but maybe our county assessors and or treasurers just need a little bit of understanding of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable underneath the statute, because based off of what you're saying here, you know, in slide 8, it says no recommendation required because we have everything we need. But maybe the county assessors and the treasurers don't see it that way. Is that something that we can work together with them on as opposed to changing statute?
And, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, when you look at the statute, it does not reference DD 214. It is just what the county treasurers are used to seeing. So the problem in the past, the couple of cases I've been involved with, as a military member, you get the 214 and you just assume it's right and you press on and then you move on and then suddenly you file for something you think you're entitled to. And then it's pointed out that it's missing from the 214, which is really the first time you realize your 214 is not right. But when you look at the statute, the veteran signs a sworn affidavit and then is required by each county to submit documentation saying that they're entitled to the exemption. It isn't limited to a 214. The problem is for most veterans, that's what you got. So you can go to your historical record and find the citation that gave you the campaign medal or find other documentation. It's usually not something the veteran keeps because they always focus on the 214. So in terms, we can certainly, at the committee's direction, look a little more deeply into how each county is looking at the exemption, because it is a county treasurer-based exemption. But in terms of statutory language, I'm not sure what you could add. It may well be an education thing that we need to work with the county treasurers to make sure they understand they can accept a wide variety of documents to verify that they're entitled to the
Senator
exemption.
Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, no, I think we do need to tweak the statute. I think we need to get into 3913 105A. It actually says that you know, you have to meet one of the 3 qualifications. And I think if we allow, and actually put in language that says these will be acceptable, the DD 214, the letters, that whatever, we'll come up with a list, then it takes the education, the guesswork out of it from the county. If it's in statute, it's clearly an acceptable form of qualification. And I think it's a quick fix. It's really not difficult to do. It gives the county clerks clear direction, and we don't have to rely on education. It's in the
Mr. Chairman,
statute. I think we ought to do it.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to belabor the issue, but to kind of move along Representative Brown's suggestion. Mr. Korupveski, what do you think about when people are out processing? Usually you're doing it a year or 2 in advance and you're preparing to retire, to stress the importance of getting your DD 214 as up to date as possible, so when you are retired, you don't have to go through these issues because you've prepared. So kind of the responsibility should be placed on the service member and not so much the county clerk in updating statutes. Thank you.
So, Mr. Colonel Smith, where does it actually say that they need to have this proof, a certain form proving that they, I'm trying to find it in here and I don't actually see it.
Mr. Chairman, it's not in the statute. It only requires a sworn affidavit. Each county, the forms are all the same. I don't know where they came from. But when you fill out the form and you swear to it, you're supposed to attach documentation proving up you're meeting the exemption. And it's put on the service member for the proof.
Mr. Chairman, generally the DD 214 is that document. Mr. Chairman, if I may, Senator Hutchings, to answer your question or address your statement, I agree. The onus should fall on the service member. The services have implemented a program called Transition Assistance Program, where this is stressed to the service member, and it's in all branches. For us to get out, you know, if I have a young Marine who's from Cody, Wyoming, and gets out in Hawaii, it's very hard for us to do that outreach to them. In the Guard, it's an easier issue, because when they out-process, you know, they know the commission is right here in state. So the larger issue is, I believe it's the member making sure all the information on their DD-214 is correct prior to exiting service.
So, Mr. Gravinsky, could we say something of the, could we add language in here that would say that for any, because it doesn't actually say that you need to have that form. But could we put some language in here that says any way proven they can accept?
Mr. Chairman, we can do that, and I would like the opportunity if Colonel Smith and I can work this between now and the next interim committee meeting to propose some language for the committee's consideration.
Yeah, because I don't think whatever that A actually says much other than they are allowed to get this exemption. Is there somewhere else that it says qualifiers? I couldn't find
No,
anything else that said qualifiers.
That's the only place, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's vague, and I think we can be more explicit. And frankly, I've got a letter, actually, June 8th, 2013, from the Department of Revenue in the state of Wyoming that discusses the metals that are currently used. And I mean, I've looked into this issue, and I really think that, and it's not, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not only for retired veterans, right? It's folks that are serving right now. And so, you know, to your point, Senator Hutchins, it's not just for those people who are looking to get out and get their DD-214 correct. It could happen to you today, and then you could wait a year to get that medal on your DD-214. If that's all the clerks are looking at, then, you know, you're out that year.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, sir, you're absolutely correct. The latest one I've dealt with was an Air Force Staff Sergeant who was in theater. He received the Global War on Terror Expeditionary Medal. He had his ripped from the Air Force in the official Air Force Personnel System Management printout of all his updated medals and ribbons. His DD-214 did not have that on there. Therefore, the county clerk would not accept the other document as an official document. I don't know if it's because you can doctor it or not, but I think we can update the language, and if it meets with the committee's approval, Colonel Smith and I will draft up some language for your consideration in the next meeting.
Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and having just received a complaint concerning this, my question would be, within the statute, should we include, and not necessarily an appeal process, but a means of who's the next higher authority, so that it's obvious as to if there's an issue and the assessor's got is intractable and won't change his mind, where you go next, as opposed to trying to call around and not knowing. Thank you.
Mr. Gravinsky.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, the way I've seen this working now, it's the veteran puts in for the exemption, they don't get it, they either contact one of the people sitting around the table, or they'll go to one of our elected representatives in DC's local representatives, and ultimately they come to me. And we work to get the individual's DD-214 corrected through the service. But we have no authority over the federal government to get that done in any expedient manner. So I don't know who that next level of authority would be.
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, just to we could set that level of authority because it's a Wyoming exemption, so we could certainly do that. We could have the Veterans Commission be the arbiter, you know, if we had to, and maybe we'll write something like that in the statute. But I just wanted to offer, if you're going to, you and Colonel Smith are going to work on this between the meetings, please call me. I'd be glad to come over in a meeting and give my 2 cents worth as well.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, absolutely.
Whether you want it or not.
We are more than happy.
You don't have to call me.
We are more than happy to have your assistance on this, so we can probably get it through on one try
Senator
instead of four.
Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with Senator Pappas. This needs to be in statute because every treasurer in the 23 counties or assessor is going to read it differently. I think caution, though, that we need to be careful with things besides the DD 214. One of my veterans showed me a non-veteran, a non-military guy who sent in on the internet, got a medal, one of the expeditionary medals, with a document that looked pretty official. And obviously it wasn't, but it looked pretty official. If I was a county assessor, I'd say, okay, yep, you got it. So I think we need to be careful with other than the DD 214. So just for what it's worth. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, I think Senator Anderson just addressed what my question was, is how congruent the assessors are on it. It sounds like they are not, so probably statute, I think we'll work on the statute and get it really clear for them. Thank you.
So we have to realize that this is also state reimbursed. So it goes to the county and the county gets the exemption, but it raises the amount of money that we have to give back to the county. So I want the committee to know that. So I think we've beat that dead horse. All right. Next on is this related updates need discussion.
Yes, sir. Turning to slide 9, number 3. At the Wyoming Air National Guard, we have 8 C-130 assets that are considered a priority level of security after 9/11. We don't want people to steal our airplanes. At the Wyoming Air Guard at the Cheyenne Airport, we have 2 types of people guarding our aircraft and our front gate in our Security Forces Squadron. We have both AGRs, Active Guard Reserve, so full-time military members wearing the uniform. We have traditional members in a duty status pulling their, 2 weeks annual tour, their other training. And then the third, which is really the second major category, so we have military members, and then we have state security officers wear the exact same uniform as the military member. They are required under the hiring authority, under the position description, to be members of the Wyoming Air National Guard, because that takes care of all their training and everything else. But they are state employees, and one of the things we came into a little over a year ago is the realization that we have extremely strong protections in Wyoming for Wyoming National Guard members functioning within the scope of their authority, their orders, their position. Broad immunities, can't ask for better language in our statutes. However, when you look at state employees, my legal opinion was I think they still fall under the same immunities given the language in our statutes. But it is an ambiguity because it doesn't specifically reference state security officers who are technically day-to-day, Monday through Friday, so to speak, state employees. They're not law enforcement officers. They're not sheriffs or police officers. They're not military members because they're not on military orders. They are state employees. So talking with the Attorney General's office, we kind of went around on this, and we realized the best answer most likely is we really need some clarifying language in the statute. In Title 7, there's a bunch of immunities for law enforcement officers. That's one place we could put it. In Title 19, involving the military department, there's another set of language about immunities for military members. So in working with the Attorney General's office, we think we just need to correct the ambiguity before it becomes an issue. So how would it become an issue? Obviously, somebody drives through the gate, drives towards one of our C-130s in a vehicle at a high rate of speed, they're going to be shot, right? We protect our aircraft. If that is a state employee, there could be a subsequent lawsuit, and we're going to be square in the middle of the ambiguity currently in the statute. That's why lawyers get big money. We argue both sides of the issue. So we would very much like to clarify this in statute.
So Colonel Smith, are they ever paid by the federal government?
Mr. Chairman, not as state employees. Well, let me rephrase. Under the state cooperative agreement, there is a reimbursement of these state employees, but they are state employees from an employment law point of view. That's one thing we clarified with the Attorney General's office. So even though the state, because the state expends money and they do get some reimbursement under the cooperative agreement for certain aspects of their employment, but they are state employees.
But are being paid by the federal, or part of their pay is coming from the federal government when they're on duty?
Mr. Chairman, it gets complicated, and I'll have to research it more carefully, because I don't believe it's 100%, and it's a reimbursement. The state, they're still state employees from a state law point of view. They are not considered federal employees.
And they're called Air National Guard State Security Officers,
That is, yes, sir, that is the title of their position description.
but they're not members of the Guard.
Mr. Chairman, they are required to be traditional members of the Guard for training and such. That's a prerequisite for the position. But when they're, Monday morning, when they're sitting there in uniform at the front gate armed, they are a state employee because they're
So-
not on military orders.
And you want it clarified in statute that they would be immune via the state immunity, because you're worried that we will find this ambiguity at some point where they do shoot somebody and we get sued and they don't fall. We quickly shun them and say, no, they're on their own. I guess that's the problem. They're state employees, which means they should have the liability of the state or the immunity of the state. They're Air National Guard, sort of. They're protecting Air National Guard equipment, and they're somewhat paid by the federal government. I guess I'm a little lost.
Mr. Chairman, everything you said is right, but that is the problem because they're not on the list of law enforcement officers who have broad immunity in the scope of their authority under state statute. They're not under the federal government's definition of a duty status as military members when they're in their state employment. So even though, just like a traditional member who's one of our security cops who works in Laramie for the university, when they're walking down the street in Laramie, even though they're a Wyoming Air National Guard member and a Security Forces trained member, if they're not in military status showing some kind of orders or a scheduled period of training, they have none of the immunities of the National Guard when they're just walking down the street. And that is what we're concerned with the state security officers. Similarly, they are not in any kind of military status.
So is this Air National Guard State Security Officer, could they apply to the retirement system as a police officer?
My understanding is they fall under the normal state employee retirement system, not the law enforcement officer retirement system.
Well, that is a question that would come up on somebody's bill, personal bill, no doubt, saying they should be made part of the law enforcement retirement. And I'm a little nervous about that because it could be quite a few people. Yes, Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, I think those are two different issues, though. But something you probably need to look at. I do believe that we ought to do something about this because you have people doing security on different statuses. I mean, you could have a Title 10 person who has immunity. You could have a Title 32 person who would have immunity. Might be the same person, but on a different day. But if you're not in status, that person ought to still have, doing the same job, ought to still have the same immunity as a Title 10 or Title 32 person. We're asking them to do the same work, right? And so I really think it ought to be fixed, that ambiguity, because, it may never come back and bite us, but it may, too. You never know.
And,
I agree. I
and
think
Mr. Chairman, Senator
security.
Pappas, to follow on with that, one of the things that makes this a little more difficult for us is you could just put them in as a law enforcement officer of the state. The problem with that, just doing that simply, is that would require them to meet all the law enforcement officer of the state training requirements, which is going to drive a training bill for the state because we're going to have to send them to the Law Enforcement Academy. The whole idea of these folks is we only take Wyoming National Guard Security Forces members so that they are trained to protect aircraft, to secure the base, and they don't need any additional training. So this is just one of the things we've bandied about, trying to figure out how do we do this? Because if you just list them as law enforcement officer, it has a training requirement we'd really like to avoid, because they are fully trained for our purposes, maybe not the broader purposes of a state law enforcement officer. So there's a little bit of challenge here in terms of language.
So you'd like a bill from LSO that would say something that would encompass those people as unambiguous. State security officers are immune from prosecution per these state immunities, whatever we have.
Mr. Chairman, yes. And Jim Peters at the Attorney General's office and I have spent hours looking at this. And, you know, there's some ideas we could put in Title 19 and treat them as a National Guard member on orders by statute. It may be that simple, but it's just something that's going to take a little bit of work. And as this committee has shown, it's a weird issue to try to explain, because we're talking about a number of interesting issues when you're looking at a state employee operating in uniform, armed on a military base.
Representative Western?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, how many Air National Guard state security officers are there currently?
Mr. Chairman, Representative
Thank you, Mr.
Western,
Chair.
I meant to tell you that. Currently, if I understand right, I believe it's 17 or 18. I think we're authorized up to low 20s in terms of state employees, but I think currently we're at around 17. And that's normally where we fluctuate.
Thank you. Do I have we can do a straw poll on this, if we're going to build a bill that will be voted on at a later meeting. So how many would like a bill to be made to cover state security officers on state immunity? 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that passed. So we will have LSO, and with the help of yours and your who'd you talk to, Attorney General?
Mr. Chairman, Jim Peters is our contact for the military department at the AG's office.
Okay. Ms. Jarvis, did you get that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so we'll have a bill and for later consideration. Representative Crank?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, try it now.
Can I talk loudly?
Apparently you'll have to.
Any other positions similar to this, possibly would need inclusion?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crank, no, those are the only positions that we have that are armed. We do, at the Joint Force Headquarters building in Cheyenne, have contracted security officers, but that's under a separate Army Guard contract and falls under their normal contractor kind of things. Up at Camp Guernsey, we have a similar contract for folks manning the gate, but those are taken care of because they're under contract.
Good questions, Representative Crank. Any other discussion on this topic? No, seeing none, we'll move on. Oh, yes.
Add here, so I'm not sure, but is there a problem with just leaving the mics on, as long as we mutter away from them or whatever we're going to say, because just a reminder, we're live streamed, and most of what you said, Representative Crank, probably didn't come through. So anyway, just a reminder.
Mr. Chairman, there's not a problem over here because Mr. Crank and I don't talk like
No.
that, so.
I'm sure you don't.
So, your comments about the person testifying will be muted, please. Military Department operates Starbase Academy. Is that the next subject?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So number 4 on slide 9 is we were approached by the Starbase Academy. So Starbase is our STEM project. I'm sure most of you are aware of. It's only in Cheyenne. It's for 5th graders. Think robots and rockets. It's really a STEM initiative that the Department of Defense has funded. It goes through the Air Guard because it's an aviation experience. And they have a foundation, a private 501c3 charitable organization that supports the Starbase. We have a similar foundation that supports the Youth Challenge Program. Those are our two youth programs from the Wyoming Military Department. What we discovered is these nonprofits often are the conduit through which a number of local businesses and really national businesses donate stuff, mostly, sometimes money. And when the foundation gives it to the program to use, think iPads. That's one that was done just last year, I believe. Technically speaking, there is nothing that allows the Wyoming Military Department stateside to accept that property as state property and account for it, manage it, maintain it. So what happens, the legal oddity of this is, it technically is still the foundation's property. So if the foundation gives a presentation screen to the Starbase Academy to use, it's technically still the foundation's property because the state has no authority to accept it in statute, which is my understanding what's required. There is a way to do this. It's really just an accounting under our state program. They would open up an account for Starbase Academy. Anything that flowed in donation-wise would be on those books. And then the state could maintain it if they wanted to. They could dispose of it if they wanted to. But the foundation would not feel like they're still on the hook for this stuff. Now, at Cowboy Challenge, we've had a number of also very generous donations of computer equipment in particular, some teaching software as well. And again, it's just odd that these programs have run for literally decades, and we have never really realized that we had this anomaly. So this is my presentation to you today on bringing up all these ambiguous situations. So what the foundation requested was, can we figure out a way that they can cleanly give these programs stuff? And in talking with Mr. Doug Shope, our state person in Wyoming, our state director, he said it's really just authority by the legislature for the state to accept and account for this stuff. And so what we're looking at how to do that, and we'd like to report at your next hearing, we will come forward with a proposition as to how to fix this ambiguity. We're very excited that these foundations are very active. Some of the large and small businesses in our state have donated very generously over the years. They get a 501c3 tax deduction from the IRS. So it's really on the receiving end that we have this problem that we need to fix. So for this one, our recommendation to the committee is if you will allow us to come up next meeting with a way to get around this and fix it.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, question, we have one in Cheyenne. Are we limited somehow to one Starbase Academy in the state, or could there be more Starbase Academies?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, as Senator Anderson may recall, there has been, the answer is one. We are funded for one, and that's a federal government funding problem. Over the years, we've talked about starting a similar program. Certainly the foundations very much has had that desire up in Casper, as well as even Gillette or other places. The problem is the federal funding will only pay for one. So the state could establish a similar program, but it'd be on the state's dime.
Senator Anderson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So the funding is the issue. So if a town came up with the funding, we could establish another Starbase. And would that, or would we need federal authority to do that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, to tell you the truth, it's been so many years since we looked at this, because we did look at it about 12 years ago for Casper. I'll have to get back to you on exactly what the mechanism is to stand up a secondary program.
And I think it is your K-12 that generally stands them up. And I assume the Starbase is actually in the sixth grade or something.
Mr. Chairman, it's fifth graders. It's actually housed at the National Guard at the old Raper Armory in Cheyenne, right by the Joint Force Headquarters. They bus the students in. It's I just forgot how many week program. But essentially they come in for that week from each school, fifth grade class. They partake of, they shoot off rockets, they build robots. And it's really an introduction for fifth graders in particular to those kind of STEM possibilities.
So right now, Colonel Smith, you don't think you'll have a bill? You want to think about this until our next meeting and then possibly bring a bill?
Mr. Chairman, the way we've done it in the past, as you know, we will probably bring forth a draft bill. It may or may not have been through LSO review, but we'll come up with a draft bill format for what language we think we need to do. And we'll work with Heather on that.
Okay, further discussion on this, Representative McGuire?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would just encourage you to, as you're working through that bill, for example, in Casper for the Veterans Museum, we just put together a nonprofit Friends of the Museum so that people can contribute to that, and then the funds can flow to the museum. And it's very important to have some kind of a nonprofit status so that major contributions will be tax deductible. So if you could just keep that in your thinking. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Representative McGuire, I think you bring up a good point, is could we, since we're talking about the Youth Challenge program, the STEM, the Starbase STEM program, and the museum in Casper, couldn't you have one section, and I don't know this for a fact, but one section of the statutes that would say that you can, as a Wyoming National Guard, accept donations, use the equipment, dispose of the equipment? Could you have that in one statute and take care of all this?
And Mr. Chairman, in response to Representative McGuire, absolutely, and that's what we're really looking at, because we realize this was brought up by the Starbase Foundation, but really the Youth Challenge Foundation, which are both 501c3 tax-deductible organizations, already existent, very vibrant boards, do a lot of good for our organization. We were thinking along those lines to be fairly generic to allow the state to receive from any nonprofit board in support of Wyoming National Guard, maybe youth programs or just programs along those lines.
Representative McGuire, would that take care of the issue if they put something in there?
That would be good, and I would just add, part of the problem with having these small boards around is that you have to continue to update and keep in touch with the IRS and keep your filings active, and that's just money and time away from, the aim of the board. So whatever you can do, that'd be great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We will consider that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
All right.
Further discussion on this STEM and STAR-based? If not, we'll move on to current National Guard Educational Assistance Program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is on slide 10. This is a little difficult. So as most of you are probably aware, the state of Wyoming has a very generous National Guard Education Assistance Program, which allows freshmen or entering college students at any of the Wyoming colleges, community colleges or UW, from joining the Guard and receiving tuition assistance. In return for that tuition assistance, which depending on the program and all is really free tuition, it basically pays for their tuition. They sign up, they join the Guard as freshmen, 18-year-olds, or somewhere along the line, and they commit to 6 years of National Guard service, which generally means after a 4-year college stint to a bachelor's degree, they owe an additional 2 years post-graduation. That's actually in the statute, in the Wyoming National Guard. So what our recruiters have found in dealing with ROTC cadets at UW in particular is many of the incoming ROTC freshmen are hesitant to join the Guard, accept the tuition payments, sign up for their 6 years of service, because their intent is or may be, or the possibility exists, that they would go active duty. If they go active duty at the end of their college career, they have to repay their tuition assistance by the function of the program. If you don't serve the 2 years postgraduate, you owe repayment to the program.
What is your definition of active duty? Does that mean regular Army or being in or National Guard?
Mr. Chairman, that's a good point. It's active duty not in the Wyoming National Guard. If they serve in the National Guard in a full-time status, part-time status, they serve that component of the tuition program. The current statute requires the repayment, We actually have a waiver process in our state rules that allow folks to waive a portion of their repayment. And that typically is if somebody joins the Guard, enlists for 6 years, and they graduate, and they've served for 4 to 5 years by the time they graduate, they are close to fulfilling their 6-year obligation. So we often will only make them repay a pro rata percentage and not the whole amount, because they really have served in the Guard during that time. But this is just somewhere in the 9 to 12 potential candidates, particularly at the UW ROTC program, are hesitant as freshmen to partake of this, to join the Guard, to serve the Guard for their college career, because they either plan or think they might go active duty with one of the full-time components, not the National Guard, and so they don't want to have to repay.
Senator Pappas?
Mr. Chairman, does this also, you say they can repay the 2 years in Guard service. What about if they go into the reserves? That doesn't count, correct? That's as is if you're inactive, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, that's right. The whole intent of the program was to encourage people to join the Guard to help pay for their college, and then continue to serve the state of Wyoming National Guard. We're giving them a free college tuition, which is extremely generous when you look over the entire nation. We have one of the best tuition assistance programs in the country from all the ones I've looked at. I haven't looked at all 50 states. But, so it is very generous, but it does have that requirement. The whole intent of it was to help people support and serve the state in exchange for their tuition. They do that through the Wyoming National Guard, which is why there's the 2 years postgraduate, 6 years total requirement in the current statute. So our recommendation is that we continue to study this issue. Many of us are very concerned that the whole idea of this program is for people to serve the state. The state's paying for your college education. We want you to come back to the state in their National Guard to continue to serve the state and not generally serve the country by going active duty in the Navy or the regular Army or the regular Air Force or the Marines. But there are those that say service is service. So why do we care?
So, Colonel Smith, is your intention to leave it as is, or is your intention to include tuition-free for everybody that comes into the military, and no matter what area they go into?
Mr. Chairman, again, this was just brought up in the last several, well, right before the interim topic period. I was going to say the last several months. We really want to look at that because, there's a lot of things that you could do. It is not our intent to say to the legislature in your generosity to just give free tuition and let people go, because that does not seem right to most of us. They do serve in the National Guard for those 4 years or 5 years of college. But there could be, you would pro rata the repayment. It could be that when you show that you've enlisted or been commissioned in a regular component that you waive the last 2 years of requirement. It could be you defer it, that if they go active duty in a 4 to 6 year period, they commit to come back to the Wyoming Guard at that end. There's a lot of options here, which is why we want to further study it. And for the next meeting of this committee to really come up with some possible solutions and a firm recommendation of the best way ahead.
So, Colonel Smith, we'd like to get some of our bills out today, or, the drafting of, and yet most of these we'll study it some more. We've got one draft bill coming. Is this something you're going to study? And I guess I'm a little lost here because we're not getting any draft bills made.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. And certainly we will commit to a draft bill for the Starbase Youth Challenge Committee for the next meeting. And this one, I think our problem is we're not sure how big the problem is. We're not sure what the statute already allows us to do. We've been looking at our state rules, and there's a lot of options. To be blunt before this committee, the Wyoming Military Department is concerned this is a great benefit for our members, and we kind of don't want to mess it up. So we don't want to create a loophole, so to speak, unintentionally. So there are some secondary effects that we want to fully consider. Certainly, sir, I will commit that we will have a draft language for a bill for the next meeting if we come up with a way to address the concern. But it could very well be it's not worth it for the 9 to 12 cadets a year that this could impact.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Yes, Senator Pappas.
So if a student, a high school student accepts this program and goes off to the University of Wyoming, goes into debt 940 or whatever it is over there, and becomes a cadet and graduates, they can get commissioned directly into the Guard, correct? They can get commissioned. So maybe the intent, if you're going to accept this, maybe somehow that education or maybe language and statute, that is, if you accept this, you're really signing up to be commissioned in the Guard. Certainly you could go active duty after your 2 years, I suppose. Or as you said, come back. I think that would be a little more problematic. Most people may want to make a active duty career, the whole career in active duty. But I think there's going to be very few people that, if they know that going into it, that they're going to have to be commissioned into the Guard. It could be Air or Army, correct? And I think maybe some clarifying language in the statute that would have to happen. But I think I agree with you. If someone wants to become an active duty member, say they want to go into missiles or something, but we don't have that in the Army Guard, in the Air Guard in Wyoming. So you have to go active duty. I think they just have to understand that when they begin, and that they're either going to have to repay, either on a pro rata basis or whatever you come up with. But I don't think we're talking a lot of people. And so, but I don't think that benefit ought to, the whole idea, like you said, we need to be able to show benefit to the state. The state is giving them the tuition free because we want them to be part of the Air Guard or Army Guard of Wyoming. And so I guess I would not be in favor of just dismissing the 2 years. But maybe something in the statute would require them to be, if they're going to get commissioned, they got to get commissioned into the Guard if we're going to pay their tuition.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, that is really the current scheme. What's interesting is if you take my understanding from the kind of, it's not statistically proven, but it looks like if you had 10 ROTC cadets at the University of Wyoming who joined the program, approximately 4 of them would commission directly on graduation into usually the Wyoming Army National Guard, because it's an Army ROTC program. But we do get a few on the air side. So 4 of the 10, approximately 4 of them would stay as enlisted folks because they want to pursue other things like a doctorate degree, and they like what they're doing. They don't like the commissioning opportunity or for whatever reason. So that's 8. And then 2 of them do other things and have to make some kind of repayment, either go active duty. Now those numbers are very generic, but the statute does not require them to commission. It requires them to serve. And at this point, we don't see any reason to change that because we do have a number of UW graduates, a number of community college graduates who don't commission and stay enlisted because they like what they do. They like the break it gives them. They don't like the commissioning opportunities currently available. And we're okay with that because they are still serving our state.
So, Colonel Smith, I hope you realize that you have 1 no vote here, if you change anything.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize that.
Okay.
And I don't think it'll be the only one.
All right, so we're going to take, unless there's something else that somebody wants to discuss on this educational aspect of this, we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. I want to remind the committee that after session, or after this committee meeting is open, after session, yeah, my head is, after this committee meeting is open about 1:30 or 2, whenever we get out of here, we will drive to Buffalo. It takes about an hour to get there, so carpool if you'd like. We are going to see the soldier, what we used to call the Soldier and Sailor's Home, the Veterans Home, and then we'll look at the site of the new skilled nursing, veteran skilled nursing, we hope, we think it's going to be there. And then we'll go to it's voluntary, a tower christening, which will be part of the WyoLink, which will be on tomorrow's schedule. So that'll be about 4:30, and then you can drive back from that. And I would like to mention that Representative Barlow just walked in the door, so thank you. And so we'll take a 15-minute break right now. Please be back, 10:15. Well, any suggestions?
I got a school board.
Gotcha.
And to adjourn. Yeah. Let's see, we're missing Funky Louds, McGuire. Seeing up there talking. It's okay, I know why. We have a quorum, sorry. If Colonel Smith would wait a second, we have a motion to be made by Senator Pappas.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, after a discussion of the last topic regarding the
National Guard
the
education.
the tuition, yeah, the National Guard education, and discussing with my fellow colleagues over the break, I would like to make a motion that we just, indefinitely table that topic, and so that we don't spend any more time or effort on it.
Okay, I have a second. Second, so that's Pappas, Steinmetz. Further discussion on the motion to table permanently, indefinitely, the National Guard Educational Assistance Program. Any
Mr. Chairman?
further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we should do that. Maybe we'd come up with something really, really incredible if they worked on it, but I understand Senator Pappas not wanting to spend too much time overhauling it.
Okay, further discussions? Senator Hutchings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we just vote on this issue?
Yes, we'll
Thank
vote
you.
on it in a minute. Further discussion, further discussion?
Question.
Question being called, all in favor of the motion to National Guard Educational Assistance Program will be indefinitely postponed, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no.
No.
It has passed. We are going to indefinitely postpone National Guard Educational Assistance Program. So, Colonel Smith, it's that much less work you have to do.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the will of the committee.
Professional and occupational licensing requirements for personnel and their spouses. Would you like to begin, Colonel Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're on slide 12. As some of you no doubt recall, we passed two bills, one involving military members and the other their spouses back in 2013, 33-1, 116, and 117, which required professional occupational licensing boards to adequately address spouses coming into the state, particularly from active duty. I mean, the issue here was when really it's about F.E. Warren being the only active duty base in the state of Wyoming. As members are PCS, permanent changes stationed to F.E. Warren, they of course often drag their spouse along, and there is occupational and professional licensing problems with them being able to obtain a new job. The spouse didn't choose to come to Wyoming all the time, although they may be excited to that, as my spouse and I were back in 1995 when the Air Force brought us to Cheyenne. But there is a problem with spouses obtaining licenses. So in 2013, we passed it and said that they should timely obtain licenses. And we then last year, Senator Ansalmi Dalton brought to the attention of this committee and the legislature as a whole that the state of Utah had passed a very comprehensive bill essentially mandating that these folks coming to Utah would just be automatically granted the ability to practice whatever profession or occupation. So that got tabled for further study. So this interim topic arose to really look at what has occurred since 2013 when this body, the legislature, address this. And this was particularly of import because last year, the 3 service secretaries, Navy, Air Force, and Army, signed a memo in February of 18 saying how states treat spouses and military members moving to their state with regard to occupational licensing is going to be a factor in the future on basing decisions, which in military parlance means deciding what missions you get, what missions you keep, whether or not we establish new places within the state. So against that backdrop, the Management Council adopted this interim topic. But it's complicated because we've identified 32 boards within the state. Unlike the state of Utah, who passed a very comprehensive statute, all of the board, occupational and professional licensing boards, except the Bar Association and I believe the medical doctor licensing, is all under one state agency, and that's just not true in Wyoming. So in Wyoming, we have 20 boards that are essentially the oversight is provided by A&I's licensing board section, and we have at least 12 other independent boards. And the next slide on page 13 shows those different boards. The independent boards, obviously, the one I'm most familiar with is the State Bar Association. This body has looked at and considered teacher licensing many times over the last few years, and Professional Teaching Standards Board is one of the independent boards. The ones on the left are all under A&I's licensing board division, who basically function as their executive director. They have 4 state employees who divide up all those different boards and help them run. So what, in talking to the A&I folks and a couple of the independent boards, we essentially in the state of Wyoming are all over the map. Some boards do not treat military spouses any differently because you can get a license within days. There's no way to expedite it because it's already so fast. Other boards, State Bar Association, for example, looks at reciprocity. If you come from a state that accepts Wyoming attorneys into your state without a lot of additional requirements, then Wyoming accepts your state's attorneys without a lot of additional requirements. Perfectly logical. It's traditional in the state bars in particular, but it causes a problem. If you're from one of those states that Wyoming doesn't have reciprocity for, you have to take the state bar test, which only happens twice a year, and so you're very limited on when you can start practicing law, to use that as the example I'm most familiar with. We've run into that with the Teaching Standards Board. You come from, every state's a little different. I remember last session with Senator Pappas as an architect, the Architect Board. You know, some states don't require any educational requirements to be an architect, apparently, except some minor certifications. Other states require bachelor's degrees. There's a wide variety, so if you want to open the door to practice, there is a state public safety component for some of these boards. So in talking with all the boards, it was very hard to try to come up with what do we do? Do we do something different? Do we rest on what was done in 13? So we started the idea in talking with the A&I licensing board division of coming up with a simple one-page survey to ask them, if I'm a spouse with a license from another state as a dietitian, to use an example, what happens? Do you give them a temporary license? How long does it take? What additional requirements? To try to get a sense of where we're going here. I've created a draft questionnaire, and I have points of contact for all the independent boards, but that's as far as I've gotten. It's just a complicated issue. So what we are proposing is, in light of the chairman's comments to me in the previous issues, we will come up with draft legislation if required for the next meeting based on our meetings with all the different divergent boards. Unfortunately, unlike some states, as I described, this is a little more complicated because we have independent boards, we have A&I control board or executive director boards, and everybody's a little different. And I'm not sure what the answer is. And for that reason, I don't have a proposed draft bill before you because I'm not sure any change is necessary because I don't know what the problem is. I know anecdotally this committee in past years has received, when we were looking at the teaching situation in particular, some anecdotal evidence of folks having trouble being delayed, coming from another state and being able to teach in our Wyoming schools. So I know anecdotally that there's a little bit of evidence out there of some issues. So that's where we stand for the committee. We need a little bit more work because I honestly don't know even what to propose at this point because of the divergence across the different boards.
So Senator Pappas, can you help out Colonel Smith in his lost wilderness?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not so sure I can, but I too agree. I think we do need some language in the statute. I do know how important it is to have the perception of how military friendly we are as a state, and to make that change, even if it's minor, puts a signal out there to DOD, and I really think it's important to do that. I do sit on a CSG advisory board for NCIC, the National Center for Interstate Compact. So I've been sitting on that, and we do have a DOD representative, Mr. Marcus Beauregard, that sits on there. And we've been, in all our compacts, we've been putting in the requirement for military spouses' ability to practice and get their either a temporary work authorization or a license prior to them PCSing into Wyoming or into any state that belongs to that particular compact. We're doing one right now for speech pathologists. We did one for the advanced nursing compact. We've done, SIPAC is doing it now for the psychologists, and there is a bunch of licensing compacts being written right now. One for dentists. It's like taking over the country as far as compacts. You will probably see those compacts come before the legislature for approval. But that's very, very important to DOD. And I think, at least for my community, we have to have really good, strong language so that we can get folks and missions and dollars put into FE Warren. We have to be very military friendly. We are, but we need to have those changes in statute. Now, that being said, I think that when you look at licensure, we certainly, as you said, we can't go to Utah's model because that's not how we're structured. But I've visited with a bunch of boards. I've visited with the CPAs. I've visited with PTSB, and they've changed a lot. And you know, Nish, the director now at PTSB, any teacher can come to Wyoming and start practicing right away, and then they can fulfill the requirements after they're practicing. And I think that's what our statute has to allow for, so that when a spouse PCS is here, they can and they do secure a job, they can start working immediately when they move here. And so, and if we've got requirements that need to be fulfilled to do that, we'll require them to do that. But we ought to not say, okay, you've got to meet these things before you begin work. I mean, you may not meet them for half the time you're here. So it's just, that's not military friendly. And architects are going to be a specific problem. And I've talked to the Board of Architecture and Landscape Architects because there's so many differences in the states. Arizona is one state that does not require even a degree. And to be licensed in Wyoming, you have not only a degree, but an accredited program. And so someone who doesn't have that is not going to get licensed in Wyoming. So we'll have to bridge those issues. And frankly, I'm not opposed to allowing these folks, even if they don't quite have the requirements, because we're not talking about a great number of spouses. We're really not talking about a lot of people. And so it's not going to affect us much. It's not like these people that come here and they're going to hang their own shingle and start their own business, because in 2 or 3 years they may be somewhere else.
They're doing a public announcement. I should have said this earlier. They're testing their facilities, and so we don't have to go to like the local bomb shelter or anything.
Okay.
Just testing the facilities and making sure the speakers work.
And so if they do decide to stay in Wyoming, say they separate from the service, the spouse is no longer covered under and they will have to meet all the requirements that anybody does. So to me, I don't think it's a big issue, and we ought to just make sure that we can get spouses working, whether it's on a temporary permit or whether it's giving them a license immediately. The speech pathologists, they can license anybody within a week, not a problem. A lot of states are not that way. Our state happens to be pretty friendly on licensure. So I don't think it's the biggest, as big of an issue as a lot of states have, but I think we ought to tweak our legislation so that we have a bill out there that makes it a little bit more friendly, because it will give a big signal to DOD when they see that passed out of the Wyoming Legislature.
Further comments from the committee?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, in terms of this, so 33-117 involves a professional occupational licensure of military spouses, and it's what was passed in 2013. And it's fairly strong. It requires the board shall issue a license to a military spouse as long as they hold relevant licensing in good standing from another state, demonstrates competency, not engaged in any act, and completes all application procedures. It also specifically allows that the board may issue a temporary practice permit, and they may consider any other work experience of the spouse credited to the work experience requirement for that license. So there's two important mays in there. The idea of this interim topic was to really look at the boards to see if they're following the statute and really if there's a problem, because there may not be a problem in Wyoming beyond those that are hard to get around, like the reciprocity issue for lawyers, the architecture degree requirement, some things that really have to do with public safety.
And I think the reciprocity, as long as they are at least as restrictive as this state, they should get their license right away. I don't know that for a fact. I do have, if nothing else from the committee, I do have somebody in the public, another Ms. Smith, that would like to speak to us about this. If you'd like to come up. I think it's unrelated, but Smith and Smith.
No obvious relation, but
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. This is a topic
Would
that
you
is...
identify yourself?
Oh, yes, I am Nicole Novotny Smith, Executive Director of the Wyoming Real Estate Commission. Thank you. And it is a pleasure to be here because this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as the daughter of a veteran and a resident of Cheyenne, Wyoming, as well as the Executive Director of the Real Estate Commission, which issues licenses for real estate salespersons, brokers, as well as our Wyoming appraisers. I agree with previous comments that we cannot necessarily envelop the state of Utah's model given the structure of our licensing boards, and I am proud to be the executive director of one of those self-funded independent boards up there on the screen. With regard to the Real Estate Commission, I don't believe we've had correspondence with the military department because we actually can provide licensing to an individual that's licensed in another state very quickly. We have about a 3 business day turnaround if individuals have met all of their criteria for real estate being able to be met within about a week through online schooling and online application. But with regard to our appraisers, sorry to say that's federally regulated. So reciprocity for appraisers looks a little bit different in my agency simply because of the way they're structured and regulated federally. But that does not mean that we wouldn't also try to expedite the application for a veteran or for a military spouse, if they made that application. But with this experience and with knowing my knowledge of licensing and managing an agency, I would like to recommend that the licensing boards, those under ANI and independent, we meet quarterly, and we would be happy to, I'm volunteering everyone, by the way, we'd be happy to provide some information and some assistance to the military department in developing this questionnaire, because I think it's important that we identify key barriers to licensing. There are some local, state, and federal barriers to consider, as well as cost. So I feel that we are ready and able to help and assist in putting together that information and then providing recommendations, a map for military spouses to assist them, and then recommendations for this committee on how we could further enhance perhaps the statute or address these issues in other ways to fully support military spouses.
So, Ms. Smith, have you changed the rules and regs to match this?
Mr. Chairman,
spouses, military
my
spouses.
agency did not, because we already had a streamlined process for individuals that are actively licensed in another state.
And do you know if, I feel like I'm asking for hearsay, but do you know if other boards have done this, have written their rules and regulations to match this?
Mr. Chairman, I do know that other boards did modify rules and regulations, if not practices. I can't speak to which boards did that, but this has been a topic of conversation for the last 2 meetings of our quarterly licensing board discussions. And so it is something that everyone is looking into, and I was sent to represent everyone, for lack of a better term here, to make sure that I could carry that back and that we could figure out how we would be best to partner and provide this assessment to meet the needs of the military department and address their concerns.
So in the case of appraisers you mentioned, don't they have to work here for a certain time, or don't they have to work under somebody? Would that be an obstruction to what we're trying to do with military spouses?
Mr. Chairman, I believe you're thinking of appraiser trainees, which is not a full-fledged appraiser, certified appraiser. If an individual is a certified appraiser in another state, they already have automated reciprocity in Wyoming, so they just have to come and present their other credential and then meet some very brief, short criteria. And we also have a temporary practice permit for appraisers that is federally mandated. So technically speaking, a person could not even reside here, but come in and work temporarily and do that through the temporary practice permit. My agency also did not choose to create a temporary practice permit because that was creating another license when we could get individuals fully licensed much more quickly with either the permit or the real estate license.
Thank you for straightening me out on that. I wasn't sure myself. Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, and I think what takes the longest time is typically the background checks. And so the background checks, if they've had one in another state, we just accept them, correct?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Pappas, in my agency, everyone has to go through a fingerprint background check for a real estate license or certified appraiser permit. For the temporary permits for appraisers, no, a federal background check is not required. However, those background checks can take anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks, depending on that process through the Department of, or AG's department.
I do believe DCI does the background checks.
Yes.
So if that is the biggest holdup, I guess Colonel Smith will come back to us and say, the following answered, and we have 82% correct or something, have changed written rules and regulations. But I noticed it does say stringent educational training, examinations and experience requirements. So I assume that when you apply, the spouse in the military applies, they will have met everything here, and then they just have to wait on their background check. That would be the ideal scenario. You'll find out a little more. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and not every board requires background check. So again, the divergence of how the boards operate in their particular areas is pretty broad in Wyoming so far that I've been able to ascertain. So it's pretty interesting trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all legislative enhancement.
Representative Newsom?
It seems as though reciprocity is the streamline that we're looking for in this. How often is that looked at again, the reciprocity things with other states? Is that common to periodically look at who we can partner with on those reciprocity agreements, or is that a one and done?
I can.
Ms. Smith, you've been nominated.
Yes, sure, happy to. Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, I believe that the subject of license portability is a very important topic at the moment. And at the moment, I believe it's being industry-driven by a lot of the professional associations and organizations that are examining those issues. And I agree that reciprocity is something that should be examined. I don't know how frequently it is, but I can say from my experience, it's something that's being pushed and driven more by industry rather than the regulatory organizations and entities.
Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anybody can answer this question or list of questions I have. Do you find that there are other career fields or industries that, like say, for instance, oil and gas, that will have people transfer to Wyoming? Are they being afforded the same type of reciprocity with their spouses as would be the military?
Colonel Smith, would you like to answer this, or would you like to deflect to Mrs. Smith?
No relation. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, I think the best answer to that is I have no idea. Our focus has been on military spouses, partly for really the central primary reason that we've touched on many times is they don't have any choice to come to Wyoming. If a private employee takes a job in Wyoming from, say, Nebraska, that is a personal choice. They don't have to take that job. When they take a job requiring some kind of occupational or professional licensing, they are assuming that risk, that delay, that requirement when they take that job. Military spouses pretty much either separate from their spouse or they're being brought to Wyoming without their choice. And that, I think, is why there's been an initiative throughout the states to make that process as simple as possible.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow-up question to that. And this is kind of sensitive, this is a voluntary military. And with the Air National Guard in particular, we know that if you're going to move, you talk to your spouse. It's kind of like a civilian job in essence, where, hey, we're going to move to Wyoming, we're going to move to Colorado. How's this going to affect the family? So it's not like you're just being forced to move here. So with that being said, are you dealing with the National Guard? Or are you dealing with F.E. Warren?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, we're dealing with F.E. Warren.
Okay.
We're dealing with active duty, and they do not have a choice. If they are enlisted members, they sign an enlistment, which is a contract enforceable by law. If you walk away from your job, we put you in jail. And certainly when someone comes and joins the Wyoming National Guard, it is more voluntary. Although I will say, if you're already on active duty, you have to ask permission to come to the Guard. If you're a commissioned officer, you don't have an enlistment contract. You essentially raise your hand and say, I'll go wherever they send me until I ask you to let me retire or separate, and I have to ask permission. So, but this is definitely a provision that has to do with active duty military members. Mostly F.E. Warren, but however, there are active duty Title X members of various recruiting for various branches who are assigned to Wyoming just like any other active duty assignment, although they're not part of a Wyoming base. So we do have active duty recruiters that also are told you're going to Wyoming.
Thank you. Any other comments from the committee? Yes, Senator. Representative Crank.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, Colonel Smith, as you transfer to Wyoming, there are some licenses that you're not necessarily precluded from practicing, say as a professional engineer. You can still come to Wyoming. You may not have your license, but somebody can still hire you as an engineer. You just can't stamp your plans and whatnot and things. So you're not really locked out of practicing. You're just waiting for your licensing to come through. Is that a correct statement? Or I don't know how many boards that would affect.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crank, that is correct. There is nothing that precludes anyone from obtaining a Wyoming professional occupational licensure. I think the national effort is simply to make sure the delay and the additional requirements the state may levy on that is as minimized as possible, just to
Senator
make it as
Pappas,
easy as possible.
I think would be a good one to answer this.
Mr. Chairman, just to answer that, it depends on the profession. If you come to Wyoming as an architect, I could hire an architect that's not licensed in Wyoming. In fact, I've got one in my office that's not licensed and doesn't care to be licensed. I'm the one who needs to be licensed, and I seal my drawings, right? But if you're a speech pathologist, every speech pathologist, if they're going to work, has to be licensed. So it depends on the profession. In my profession, you know, only the architect that's going to put his seal on the drawing, his or her seal on the drawing, needs to have the license. There's a lot of non-licensed architects in Wyoming, but that's not true of someone who's practicing one of those other professions. If you're a nurse, you need to have a license or you can't practice.
Committee, any other comments? I'll open it up for the public in case. Oh, Representative Laux.
Mr. Chairman, Colonel, just getting back to the meat of this thing, I mean, do we really have a problem with this or not? Do we really need to do something with this, or? I don't see the problem.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux, that is what we're trying to assess, to be blunt. We gave the boards the power back in 2013 for temporary licensing to do all the right things. We're just trying to we're just trying to prove nationally, and really for the legislature to know that their previous efforts have borne fruit. So really, we just want to confirm if we're doing the right thing, change it if we can do more. And I did want to mention one other thing. Senator Pappas mentioned the compacts, and they have exploded. I mean, the first one I think was EMS, and there are compacts for lawyers, doctors, nurses, teachers out there percolating around. In every compact, I've looked at about 3 or 4 of them, in every one of them says if you're from a compact state, you have an incredibly expedited, fill out an application, pay a fee, and you're in another compact state. It basically is leveling the floor, so to speak, on a commonality of experience, degrees, certifications. And it's a great thing. And at some point, we won't even be talking about this, probably because every occupation and profession will have a compact.
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, and to that point, and to Representative Newsom's thought on reciprocity, certainly a lot of professions only have reciprocity with a limited number of states. Architecture happens to have 54 jurisdictions, all states and 4 territories, but a lot of them will only have 15 or 20 states that they can be reciprocal with. But and the same way under the compacts. There's maybe 6 or 8 compacts that are all 50 states belong to, and every compact has a minimum number of states that whenever you hit that trigger state, 10 states or 15 states, then the compact goes into effect. And then there's 2 different models. There's an expedited licensure model where you can get your license. You know, what they do is they still license you. They'll give you a Wyoming license if you're part of the compact, but it's expedited. They don't look at your credentials. They look, you know, because that was done in one of the other compact states. So, you know, within the week you can get your license and go. But then there's also another model where they for instance, the nursing folks, they have what's called, you get 1 license in your original state, and then you get a privilege to practice in the other state. So you really only have 1 license. And the states will charge you a fee to, you know, because that's how they pay for the state boards, for that privilege to practice, but you only gain 1 license. The medical doctors, they didn't do that. They want a license in every state, because most of the medical boards want to have authority over that and want to be able to go after a doctor if you don't have a license, you really can't go after them. You have to contact that state that has a license, and they can go after them. But that sometimes proves difficult. If they haven't violated it, they violated the law in Wyoming, but they haven't violated in their original state, good luck trying to get the original state to go after them. So you'll see probably in Wyoming that most of the boards are going to want to have a license. But in all these compacts coming up and the ones in the past, the military spouse issue is big, and DOD sends people to sit on those drafting teams to make sure that happens. So,
Further comments from the committee? Yes, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, back to Senator Hutchings' comment and Representative Laux' observation, having a problem. Private enterprise has the same thing as the volunteer Army does. If you get an assignment to move to Wyoming, you have that choice, or you separate from the organization. Same thing with the military. So I'm not sure we really have a problem here that we don't have in private enterprise also. So thank you.
And Colonel Smith will bring back that information to us. Ms. Nicole Novotny Smith, do you have something to say? No. Okay, I'll open it up for the public. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kevin Bonenblust. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Medicine, which licenses and regulates practice by close to 5,000 physicians and physician assistants in the state.
Would you give your last name again, please?
Certainly. Bonenblust, B-O-H-N-E-N-B-L-U-S-T. It's traditional spelling. Anyway, I was going to come up here and explain to you what we've been doing with compacts, and Senator Pappas beat me to it. He and I have a friend who quite literally wrote the textbook on interstate compacts, a gentleman named Rick Masters, who was integral to what CSG's Interstate Compact Center does. And I will tell you that the Board of Medicine, for instance, has been attuned to this long before the military came here, and with all due respect, because a couple of your colleagues, Senator Scott and late Senator Schiffer, at an interim committee meeting of the Labor Committee, turned me into the piñata of the day about why it was taking so long to get licenses for physicians in Wyoming. So, for instance, our board has taken two different avenues. One is to try and speed up our internal processes for everybody who comes down the pike. And now we're to the point where every single applicant gets reviewed at least twice for a temporary license, trying to expedite that. But then we realized there was more we could do on that national level. And the idea of reciprocity is a nice one, but the problem is you wind up doing almost one-off with each state. It's bit by bit, and everybody starts negotiating back and forth, well, we want this, we want that, and pretty soon it falls apart. About 7 years ago, actually, the Federation of State Medical Boards convened a meeting of all the states it could get, and our former Governor Jim Geringer, in his consultant's capacity, was the keynote speaker for it. And they said, look, compacts may be the way to address this, where states get together, and it's a tool that is granted under the Constitution, where states can create a solution to a shared problem and not have to have the federal government looking at it, not have the federal government controlling it. It's state to state, and we're dealing with something. So that's, for instance, how we regulate all of our rivers. Now, whether you like how that works or not, at least that's analogous. The same reason you can drive from state to state with single driver's licenses because of an interstate compact. Well, about 6 years ago then, my board proposed to the Federation of State Medical Boards that we study doing an interstate compact for physician licensing. And if you've ever wanted to run into, we want to do it our way, not your way, physician licensing is the place it happens. The only place it's worse is law. I'm a recovering attorney, I know. So, but what I will tell you is this, that went through, and 4 years ago, this legislature was the first legislature in the country to adopt the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact. We now have 29 states, the District of Columbia, and the Territory of Guam, plus we have pending legislation in several other states. It's grown explosively. 20% of the licenses we issue now are issued through that compact. And that's the sort of thing we've done in response to these concerns, but rather than carve it out to be simply military spouses and military members, which is not to say anything negative, we said when it comes to getting a physician practicing in Wyoming, we really don't care if you're a military spouse or not. We want you practicing in Wyoming. And so following on that, the State Board of Nursing went ahead and joined with the legislature's blessing on the compact there. This last session, or previous session, excuse me, you passed the replica, which is the EMS compact. I know you've got others coming. It's a great way for states to fix something without the federal government saying, here's how ye shall do it. So all of that is to say, I think this is a great opportunity, and I know I can speak for my board. I'm very careful to not speak for others, but I know we will certainly work with the military department. I think this may go beyond a questionnaire, because I think there needs to be some explanation of what our processes are and that sort of thing, but we certainly want to help with that. We think we've got a lot of the right things in place, and maybe with deferring to if we have compacts in place with boards, and then if you feel a need to do something else in addition, great, but having maybe that compact being a qualifying thing for a board to consider in compliance with what the legislature would like to see. That would just be the suggestion from my board, but we certainly look forward to working with the military department and our other sister boards on this.
Comments from the committee? Yes, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm curious about the pharmacy board. Is there a separate board, or is that come under the Board of Medicine?
Mr. Chairman, that is a different board, and there's actually a representative here from the Board of Pharmacy, and I would be happy to let him speak to what their board does, because I'm only responsible for mine. They're not on the list. It's actually, I think, State Board of Pharmacy is supposed to be on there. Yeah.
So, is it Boniface?
Boniface, perfect.
Boniface. Can you tell us if you wrote your rules and regulations, if you changed them in 13 after we passed this legislation? Did you have to change anything?
Mr. Chairman, at that point, we didn't feel we needed to, because we were examining every single applicant for a temporary license. And what we were saying was basically what was discussed previously. If you've been licensed elsewhere, we know you've met a standard that's pretty darn close to ours. So if we get the basic stuff we have to have, name, address, those things, a release and waiver for us to be able to look into you, then we're going to go ahead and issue a temporary license while we wait for the rest of the paperwork to catch up to you, because somebody's already vetted you in another state. Well, our interstate compact is that system on steroids, where we don't even get that paperwork. We get a note that says, Colorado says this doctor from Colorado Children's has been licensed in their state. They're clean. They run a criminal background check. Please issue a license. Quite literally, that day we get it, we issue a license. So we adapted it for everyone, not simply military spouses, in response to the legislation of 13.
Further comments from the committee?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, so if we mess around too much with this, could we, you have a really good system, it sounds like. If we do very many changes for the military, we may, in your case, make it harder for them to get their licensure. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I would say do it carefully. And so if there's a way to protect the systems that are in place and working well and meet what the military department feels DOD needs to see, then I think in those cases, let it ride. Because I do think, as Senator Papa said, you're going to see more and more of these compacts, because states are realizing, whether it's medicine or architecture or anything else, practice of professions is multi-state now, and so that's just the reality of the world. And so I would say that if you maybe build in that protection, says if you've got a compact in place, interstate compact, you don't have to do these other things. Something like that, something creative I think we can come up with in meeting.
Other comments from the committee? Yes, Representative Laux. Microphone.
That's a good idea. So, Mr. Chairman, question concerning, so are the safeguards there, as you know, to prevent a doctor coming from another state, that the state didn't give you all the information as we know about from the state of Georgia? That happened in Casper, as you know, and you were well involved with it and very helpful in all that process. So are the safeguards there to be able to see that background from another state that they might have avoided giving you information on, like happened out of Georgia? Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux. Of course, the healthcare licensing boards are kind of their own thing, because there's national data banks that have to have reports made to them and so on. We'd like to think they are. On occasion, there will be someone gets through. We do the best we can. That's why, for instance, to use our interstate compact, first off, our board doesn't do 100% criminal background checks coming in. Not that that catches everything, but that's one of those kind of catch points. But to use our compact, to get that fast movement through, we've said you must have a criminal background check. So when one of our docs wants to enter the system, even though we didn't do a criminal background check to originally license him, we're going to have to do it now to get it into the compact system. Because we're vouching to other states that this doctor's got a good record. So try to do exactly that sort of thing.
Mr. Chair,
Representative Love.
and that, you think that'd be caught then with,
Mr. Chairman and Representative Laux, in the case we're discussing, because that person had been under everybody's radar, I couldn't say that it would have happened. I just can't say that because there have been no prosecutions, there have been no disciplinary actions, no hospitals have taken any actions. I think that was a product of an era that has gone away very quickly in light of all sorts of things that have happened in our culture in the last 3 or 4 years. I think that's something that's going away very quickly. But I don't think anything would have caught that.
Mr. Chairman?
Further comments? Senator Anderson.
Who does your background checks? I've heard DCI, I think the FBI does it, I think there's contractors that do it. Who does the medical?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, we do send ours through DCI. We do still get the fingerprint cards and then send them to DCI. I know from other states, there are oftentimes contractors that will run them, but for us, DCI does both the state check and the federal check. And that was one of the hurdles we had to get past with our compact, was the FBI was very particular about how we did that. They were very protective of their data, if you can imagine that. And so we had to jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure we were protecting that data and protecting the subject's rights in having their fingerprints rolled and run.
Further comments from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Barnabas.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next, anybody else in the public like to speak on this compacts and licensing of spouses? Please come forward, state your name.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Matt Martineau. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Board of Pharmacy. And I'd just like to echo some of Nicole Novotny's and Kevin Bonham-Bless's comments that our particular licensing board is in a very good situation. We're able to process applications very quickly. And to my knowledge, we do not have any significant hurdles or difficulties that would be unique to members of the military. We have multiple mechanisms to help us engage with them and ease that process as much as possible. We're part of a national association called the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. So that helps us with our reciprocity process. So a pharmacist licensed in Colorado or Massachusetts or California or Guam or Puerto Rico, anything like that, they can apply through NABP. They give us an application. And then the only thing that they're having to do is meet the state requirements, which is demonstrate knowledge of our laws and competence with those. And in the meantime, we're able to issue a temporary permit to them as well that's valid for 6 months. So that gives them the opportunity to be here, to practice, to get familiar with things. And again, we have a very short turnaround time or process time to be able to issue both the temporary license and that authorization to even take and pass that exam. We can grant extensions to the expiration date on the temporary license as needed. If they, for example, were very early in their process and they didn't actually move to Wyoming, because to my understanding, members of the military are informed months before their move. So someone who's particularly gung-ho might apply to the process and we might issue them a license 3 months before they're actually here, so we have the discretion to extend that. So again, we're very committed to working with this and identifying any barriers. But again, I'm happy to report that to my knowledge, there are none. So beyond that, I'd stand for questions or...
Questions from the committee? Thank you, Mr. Martineau. I appreciate your coming forward. So there's one board that you have to address for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My biggest fear in putting together this list was how many people I was not getting. So it now stands at one more.
Mr.
So
Chairman.
you won't be offended by those Yes.
Sure. There's a one caveat in all of this, is if they come from a state that has no licensure. And so, for instance, the landscape professionals in Colorado. So if you've got a spouse that's been down in Colorado Springs and they get PCS'd up to F.E. Warren, and they've been doing landscape architecture in Colorado. Colorado doesn't require a landscape architect to be licensed, but Wyoming does. So that's going to be, you know, if they've never held a license somewhere else, I don't think there's too many of those situations, but that's one caveat, that it may be a barrier for them to work if they've never had a license somewhere else.
Further comments from the committee? Anybody in the public like to speak on the spousal licensing for the military? Going once, going twice. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when we discussed this during maybe just before legislature, might have been the last meeting that the idea was brought to us, there was a lot of input by education. So those would be some people that you need to visit with and see if we can even do this with them, and hopefully we'll get them to the next meeting that we discuss this heavily at.
That'd be the Teachers Standards Board is what you're speaking of? Okay. Okay. And you'll have discussions with them, no doubt, before now and...
Mr. Chairman, yes, in fact, I have talked to one of their licensing people, and again, it sounds like they do a temporary license. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of roadblocks to immediately entering into work, with some additional requirements having to be met within a certain time frame.
Okay. Fine. Any other comments from the committee? Yes?
You know, this may not end up in legislation. I said earlier that it'd be nice to have a bill that would kind of be out there, but if your report comes up and says, hey, you know, we have no, I think if we kind of issue a report stating that we looked at it, I think that would be probably just as effective as actually having to change something. But we need to make a statement so DOD understands that we've looked at it, hey, we're great to go, there's not a problem with any of our boards. And if there's a problem with one of the boards, maybe it's not a legislative fix. Maybe it's just a fix with the board, rules and regs. So,
or we could dismantle that board. There we go.
Could do that too.
Mr. Chairman, I feel the need, given your last comment, to say that the boards I've contacted, and I have not talked to them all, have all been very supportive and helpful.
That is good to hear. And nicely politically said. Any other comments from the committee? Yes. Representative Overmule, I haven't heard from you all morning.
Thank you. I just woke up.
Okay.
Get a hold of it.
Hold it 2 seconds.
There it is. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, I wanted to ask you about what's driving this topic. Do you get the feedback you get from the spouses? Are there particular points of interest? Some of these that are driving it. What's the background? Why are you looking at this?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mueller, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's become a national issue within the military. The service secretaries have continuously stated, particularly in the last 2 years or so, that military-friendly states are going to be a factor in determining where they put assets and missions and bases and base closures. And it's nothing new, really. I was looking at Senator Pappas because, you know, several years ago we went through a BRAC, a base realignment and closure thing, and certainly in Cheyenne it was a big deal because F.E. Warren was looked at as most military bases nationally as the DOD tried to consolidate, save money. So anything that we can do as a state to encourage nationally our DOD to see that we work hard to support our military versus some other states that maybe don't have the political will to do that. So that's certainly the biggest driver. We attempted in working with F.E. Warren to try to get some numbers, how many spouses have ever complained about licensing. And there's really no mechanism that we could find that, it depends on who they talk to and if they raise the issue up the chain. I think several of the committee members here have historically heard from a constituent or two complaining of some process that didn't go very well or very fast or as fast as they wanted or was more complicated than they wished it was. And so again, it's just, are we doing all we can and is there more we can do, which is really what I took to be the task of the military department.
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chairman, and just to add to that, not only does it, make us look good in DOD's eyes, I really just think it's the right thing to do for these spouses. It is the right thing to do. These folks, they have plenty of hardship. When they PCS, 15 times in their entire career, they're moving their children around, they've got enough stress in their lives. And just to add this one additional hurdle, it's just the right thing to do.
Thank you. Other further comments from the committee? Seeing none, we'll wait for your report, Colonel.
Yes, sir. And with that, sir, we move on. And Mr. Kravitsky has the next one.
Yes, Veterans Claim Service and Funding. Mr. Gravinsky.
Mr. Chairman, funding to support veterans claim services. Currently, the Veteran Service Organization, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, will not be able to sustain the Department Service Officer at the regional office in Cheyenne past fiscal year 2020. So what's the so what behind that? The so what is, as a commission, our 7 state service officers, and to be recognized by the VA is a state agency who can process claims, we have memorandums of agreement with the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, and the Disabled American Veterans. What they do is they act as power of attorney or the attorney in fact for a veteran when a claim goes through, and should it need to go to the Board of Veterans Appeals. They give us legal representation in both DC and here. So if we lose that position, that's going to decrease our ability, whether you're a state service officer or a county service officer, to funnel claims through those the only 3 service organizations in the state that can act as power of attorney on our behalf. So what we're going to do, and this doesn't require a bill, this is just an update of where we're at today in the state. Currently, we pay the American Legion $50,000 a year for their department service officer. So we have an agreement with them because their funding model just can't support it. The organizations like the American Legion, the VFW, their operating costs haven't gone down. The membership has. And they just don't have the bandwidth to take this on anymore. DAV, the Disabled American Veterans, they have a completely different service model. I don't think this will ever be an issue with the DAV. But if we don't fund this position, last year, I'll give you an example. We submitted about 1,280 claims, our 7 service officers, which brought in about $30 million in compensation and pension benefits to Wyoming veterans. On an annual basis, the VA is paying approximately $174 to $178 million a year in compensation and pension benefits to Wyoming veterans. It's money that gets spent in the state. It's money that our veterans use. And what we're going to do is we're going to tag the Adjutant General, General Porter, intends to put in a supplemental budget request in the governor's budget for $50,000 a year or $100,000 for the biannual and try to get that part of the standard budget. If we lose that position, not only do my service officers' claims stop, but there are veterans, and about 25% of the veterans in the state are in Laramie County area. A lot of veterans don't use our state service officers or county service officers in that area. They go directly to the VA regional office and they work directly with those organizations. So if you can imagine, if I lose 1/3 of my capacity to funnel claims to the Veterans Benefits Administration, what the backlog is going to be when we only have 2 department service officers who can do this. So we need help. We need to help the VFW. Without them, our organization, without those 3 veteran service organizations, the commission would not be accredited to file claims.
So, Mr. Gavinsky, what was the total number of claims that you had? that
Last
brought
year,
30
approximately
million?
1,280. So we could get that on a monthly basis, real time. The lagging indicator is how much money is brought into the state a month. Because I could file a claim in January, and that claim could get through the VBA June, July, August, when the veteran gets their rating. So it's a lagging indicator. What we get at the end of the year, and it usually the VA is a little slow. In 2013, it was 174, 178 million in compensation and pension. That's not including medical. That's not including VA home loans. That's just for compensation and pension benefits.
Mr. Kravinsky, didn't we allow another Veterans Claims Officer?
Yes, sir. In the last session, in the general session, we were given another position to be a state service officer to work for the Wyoming Veterans Commission. We're going to put that individual in the southwest corner of the state. We don't have a state service officer down there. Currently, what I'm doing is my service officer from Riverton is servicing the Riverton area, driving down to Uinta County and up to Teton County.
So how many do we have?
We have, once we hire this position, we will have a total of 8 state service officers who work for the commission. You have 3 county service officers, one in Sublette, Sweetwater, and Lincoln, which I don't have any oversight or authority over.
Who do they work for?
They work for the Human Resources Manager in Sweetwater County, Gary McLean.
And you don't have any?
We work their training. We buy some of their software so they can file claims, but I don't have oversight and authority. I can't tell them this is the way you need to be trained.
But they're veterans claims?
They're county service officers, and to their credit, sir, the county service officers existed well before the commission. Those 3 counties recognized years and years and years ago that, hey, we have veterans who are getting out of the service who need help filing their pension and benefits paperwork.
So you have 8 plus 3?
8 plus 3 county service officers, and there's a health department paid for through the Keeney Foundation. Lisa Griffith up at the Veterans Home, you'll probably meet her today. She doesn't work for the commission either. That's a paid position by the Keeney Foundation. And, but she works well. We get all her claims data, and we work well together. So if I give you a contrast, sir, so you have the 8 plus the 3 county, it's 11 plus the 1, so 12. A state that has probably about 4,000 more veterans than we do, North Dakota, has a county service officer in every county. They have 53 counties.
So you're saying this department service officer, which we semi-fund, I guess.
We do at the Legion, sir.
That person is under your, no, he's not under your rule?
No, sir. The way it works is, in order for the Veterans Commission, in order for us to provide complete claim services, that means the veteran walks in the door to file a claim, all the way through having representation. If the claim comes back and the veteran disagrees with the Board of Veterans Appeals, you need an attorney to represent you. The DAV's attorneys, the American Legion attorneys, and the VFW attorneys represent our veterans in Washington, D.C. before the Board of Veterans Appeals. So we have an MOU with those 3 veteran service organizations to provide that complete claim service. But what it allows our service officers to do is completely build the claim. The veteran, when I retired, I filled out my claim, and they asked, who do you want to represent you? I had the American Legion. So they would represent me as attorney in fact if my benefits claim came back and I disagreed with it and I wanted to go before a Board of Veterans Appeal.
So you're saying this department service officer, which is a VFW person or contracted to the VFW, is an attorney or is not an attorney?
He is not an attorney, sir, or she is not. The organization, the Veterans of Foreign War organization, will represent you before the Board of Veterans Appeal in Washington, D.C., because their service officers are accredited at the national level with their organizations. Some of the bigger states do it completely soup to nuts, Texas, but they can afford to have a bunch of attorneys in Washington, D.C. representing their veterans or in the state. That model won't work for us. So we have MOUs with these three veteran service organizations, Mr. Chairman.
So you're saying, let me get this straight, I'm trying to get this, my head wrapped around this. Department Service Officer has some other certification above what your Veterans Claims Officers have, and they can put the case together that they then turn over to an attorney, VFW and or Legion, and they can represent the veteran. It may be a veteran that you have dealt with in the past, but you cannot bring it to the level that the DSO can?
Correct, sir. So if I'm a veteran, let me just, if I may give an example. If I'm a veteran in Cody, it's not convenient for me to go down to Cheyenne to meet with the Department Service Officer, who can provide complete claim services. So we have a state service officer in Cody who has complete access to the system, entirely builds that claim. We send it through our internal quality control mechanism, and then we send it to one of those 3 service organizations who file it with the Veterans Benefits Administration. When that claim comes back, the veterans rated 30% and they believe that they should be 60%. Then that will go before the Board of Veterans Appeals. Those 3 organizations are recognized at the national level by the VA to represent a veteran as attorney in fact, to go and adjudicate their claim. So it's really, in my humble opinion, sir, it's a bargain. I have one service organization, the DAV, that we don't have. We have an MOU to represent us as attorney in fact. Another service organization, we already pay the Legion $50,000 a year to have that department service officer. And now the VFW's finances won't allow for them to keep that position past 2022. So the crux of the matter is the VFW tells me, hey, Steve, that position's going away. Now I have 2 organizations in which I can file claims through on behalf of veterans of the state of Wyoming. And that will cause a monumental backlog on our end before it even gets to the Veterans Benefits Administration.
Okay.
It's
Mr.
a very
Krasinski.
convoluted process, sir.
Yes. The United States Department of Veterans Affairs requires the state to have this agreement with the service organizations for the Veterans Commission to be a VA-recognized state agency. All 3 of them, the Legion, the VFW, and what is it?
The Veterans of Foreign War, sir.
Okay, so VFW and the Legion, 2 of the 3, or is there a third organization?
There's the Disabled American Veterans Organization.
Okay.
There's the American Legion, sir, and there's the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
So if we don't have with all 3 of them the agreement signed, or just one of the 3, what do we need here?
If I only had the DAV, if funding went away and I couldn't afford to fund the Legion or the VFW, every claim that a service officer filed in this state, whether a state service officer or a county service officer, would have to funnel through the DAV. And they have one department service officer and one administrative assistant, and they would have to pick up all the additional claims that the other 2 service organizations are not sending to the Veterans, the Veterans Benefits Administration.
Representative Western, you have something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Krasinski, how many disputed claims come out of Wyoming, whether it be on an annual basis or otherwise? What's the volume we're talking here? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, that's Mr. Chairman and Representative Western. I don't have the exact number, but we deal with a lot of claims that go to adjudication between the Board of Veterans Appeals. I can get you that data. I would have to go to the VFW, the Legion, and the DAV. But even if it's not, even if the veteran agrees, those 3 service organizations are the only ones recognized by the Veterans Benefits Administration to file the claim. We can build the claim, we can offer complete claim services with the exception of representing the veteran as power of attorney or attorney in fact. So when I filed my claim when I got out of the service, the American Legion filed it, I got my rating, I didn't dispute my rating. Everything was great, but they still were the organization that had to file the claim.
Senator Anderson?
It's a team effort. You need both components, the state, the county, and the Department Service Organization.
Mr. Chairman, so if you ask for funds inclusion on the governor's 2020 budget, would you propose funding the VFW or another American Legion person or another DAV person?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Anderson, I would ask for another I would fund the VFW.
So do the others already deal in this state, the Legion and the Veterans?
DAV.
DAV.
Yes, sir. So those are the only three service organizations in the state of Wyoming that the Veterans Benefits Administration recognizes as an authorized agency to act as an attorney in fact for a veteran.
Okay, so on this one line where it says the Department of Veterans Affairs requires you to have, does it require you to have it with all three, or does it require to have one?
Mr. Chairman, I could have it with just one, but I wouldn't be able to keep up with the claims in the state.
But as a recognized, to be a VA recognized state agency, could you have one?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we could have it with just one because we meet the criteria of an agency that's VBA accredited.
Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Kravinsky, the county officers, Sweetwater, Sublette, and Lincoln, do they have to go through the VFW or the American Legion? So that's my first question.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Blake, yes.
That was an easy question.
And I don't have another question, but I have a comment maybe later.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Further comment? Yes, Representative
Thank you, Mr.
Brown.
Chairman. Mr. Kravitsky, so I'm kind of curious here, maybe you may not have this information readily available, but I'm curious what other states fund out of their general fund these organizations like this as well to continue to fund these types of claim services and stuff like that. I recognize the benefit, but I'm just curious, what do other states do? I see that basically this is a growing issue, and it is $50,000 now going to grow into $100,000 a year in 2 years, just with inflation, stuff like that.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, a lot of states do complete claim services without the service organizations. Some do it both ways. The state can do it, and they still have memorandums of agreement with service organizations. I believe North Dakota is another state that actually funds, Montana funds their service, department service officers.
So I think it's really important for, and Representative Western said this, to get the appeals, how many appeals we do have.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, absolutely, I will get that information, but it's more than just the appeal to represent them. It's the fact that any claim that goes through has to go through one of those three service organizations, whether it's appealed or not. The VBA, Veterans Benefits Administration, recognizes those three department service officers or those three veteran service organizations in our state is certified to act as that power of attorney. The fact that you need the power of attorney is, in my opinion, secondary. You didn't agree with the claim. But somebody has to represent you when that claim is submitted, because essentially, when you file a claim, you're suing the federal government.
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of maybe just a follow-up question in regards to that. So the Veterans Benefit Administration recognizes those three organizations. Would it help the situation to have additional organizations be recognized? Again, I know that's probably a federal issue outside the purview of the state jurisdiction, but just as a general question.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Western, that's a very good question. Those service organizations have to have the ability to step up and do that. In our state, organizations like the Marine Corps League or the Military Order of the Purple Heart are just too small to take this on. And I will tell you, organizations like the Military Order of Purple Heart used to do it in a lot more states, and just a year ago they pulled back because of the costs.
So I'm trying to get this correct. Mr. Kravinsky, in the state service officers, which you will have 8 if you hire this other person, they have to then apply to they send in the claim to the VA, to the DAV, the VFW, or the Legion first, and then it goes to the federal?
Yes, sir. So my service officers across the state will completely build that claim. They will look at your medical records. They will look at all the evidence. They will completely build that claim. Then it'll go to my quality control person to verify it. We have some of the lowest rates of rework because of that function. We will ask the veteran, who would you like to represent you as attorney in fact, in case you go to the Board of Veterans Appeal, and the veteran will tell us either the VFW, the American Legion, or the DAV, and we will send that claim, which is fully completed, to them after it hits our quality control, and then they will send it to the VBA, Veterans Benefits Administration, because they are recognized by the VA, because they have the attorneys to represent the veteran. The state does not.
So this is all within the state. This would be a Wyoming resident that submits a claim, has some issue, submits a claim, and after you've done your quality control, it then goes to one of those three organizations, and then it goes to the Veterans
Benefits Administration. Yes, sir, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Because my service officers can't bypass that because we don't have the attorneys to represent the veteran in DC.
Okay. Representative Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question I have is, where does the American Legion get their money, and where does DAV get their money to perform the service?
So they get, so the funding, it depends on the organization. Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, my apology. The DAV has a very different operating model. Their service officers are NSOs, National Service Officers, and they happen to be in Wyoming. They have multiple in some states that have larger population of veterans. Our state, they have one. The DAV national level funds that position. In Wyoming, they get partial funding from the national level, very little, a couple of $1,000s, and the rest is done out of the Wyoming Department of Veterans of Foreign Wars, pays for it. Same thing with the American Legion. So their funding models have changed. You don't see veterans going to the Legion post home Monday through Friday, you know, having beers or meeting with their friends. It's more of a, unless they change their operating model, I fear that a lot of these homes are going to go under. Because the model of the veteran that gets out now, they want to get their benefits and they want to spend time with their family. And these organizations, again, this is opinion from a veteran. I'm a member of the American Legion. I don't go hang out at the post home 4 or 5 nights a week. When I was here as a captain at F.E. Warren, I probably went twice a week. It's just the model has changed. I was single back then. Now I'm married. I have a couple of kids. And those organizations aren't set up for that. The DAV doesn't have a post home. They don't have the overhead that some of these other organizations have.
Further question? Yes.
A follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then, kind of tagging on to Representative Brown's question a few questions ago, can we look forward then to the American Legion not being able to do this as well in the future?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, we already pay the American Legion $50,000 a year. So I pay 65% of the Department Service Officer's salary right now. The American Legion picks up the other 35%.
So this is in addition to the money we already send to the Legion?
This is, Mr. Chairman, this is now to go to the VFW. Because they're running into the same problem the American Legion ran into about, I don't know how many years ago it was, probably about, I'd say 4 to 6, that we were given the money through the budget to increase the Veterans Commission budget to pay for that. Because the alternative is not filing claims for veterans or having a massive backlog, and it not being the VA's fault, it's being the state's fault.
Representatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to clarify, this potential money going to the VFW will put the VFW and the American Legion on a level playing field?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, absolutely. I will be paying the same amount to both organizations, approximately 65% of the cost to operate that office.
So who funds the disabled veterans and the DAV?
Mr. Chairman, the DAV, the national level funds their service officer. Their operating model is completely different. They are focused on disabled veterans. They don't have post homes around the state. Their main focus is getting benefits into the hands of veterans. I mean, I believe all service organizations are like that, but the DAV just has a completely different operating model. And I've talked with the DAV, and they don't foresee this ever becoming an issue.
Representative McGuire?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I speak for Representative Obermueller when we agree that job creation is good and that this is kind of getting into a budgetary item. I think the important thing is for us to continue to be able to help you and support it is to bring us the numbers, because obviously these people are bringing in massive amounts of money to the state. Federal funds, which we rely on, that's good. But I think that this is a matter for as we get into the budget issue.
Well, my question would be, though, and Representative McGuire, I think you're quite correct. It's a budget they're going to apply, but if they don't get it, then it will be too late. In other words, somebody will have to take it up as a personal bill for this budget session if they so choose. And Mr. Kravinsky, I think you understand that, you know, if he puts it in his budget and they reject it, we'll have to do something differently, and it'll have to be a personal bill by somebody.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, that's why I'm bringing it up now. It's 2019. This is going to happen in 2022 is the last year they will be able to fund it. I've looked at their funding model for the state. I had their state adjutant, quartermaster, same position, come to my office with their funding before I even brought this up as an issue.
So, well, General Porter, though, if he goes in 2020, he goes in July 1 of 2020 will start the new budget. He doesn't need the money for 2 more years. So what is he asking for?
Mr. Chairman, you're right. In 2022 is when they have funding okay? They're not doing that great right now. We're just trying to get ahead of the bow wave to get this out there, because last time, I will tell you, in the last budget session, I asked for $300,000. It was part of our supplemental budget to pay the Legion and our quality control expert. So I asked for $300,000 in the last budget session to pick up the VFW because their operating costs, again, were declining, and this would have provided them some relief. I was unable to get the additional $100,000, but I got the $200,000 as part of the standard budget. So now I don't have to go back every budget session for a supplemental. That's part of my standard operating budget now. So we're trying to get this out there now, because if I wait until 2022, I'm too late.
I could see you waiting till July 1 of 2022, and hopefully in December of 21, you would apply for the money, and that we'd give it as in 2022, we would pass that budget. I don't know what the general is going to do for the next 2 years. He's going to get $50,000 each year that he's going to put into his general fund, I guess, making it a standard budget item, but it really won't help the VFW, and he'll get used to having extra 100,000 around. So I'm just curious if he may inform them, but we cannot obligate money going forward if it's not part of the standard budget. I'm a little lost on this, but that's what I think will happen.
Mr. Chairman, just on that, I think looking at the projections, the idea was in the second year of the biennial budget, the money would be necessary. So it would go in as a standard budget item for the biennial budget, but only funded for the second year. Because in the second year, when we say 2022, it doesn't mean necessarily July. It could be December of the previous year that they basically are cutting loose their person. So I think our concept, budget-wise, was the second biennial year would be when the funds would probably become necessary to keep the service officer.
And that would stay as a standard budget item?
Right.
So, and the federal government does, I don't know how this veterans would, but the standard budget for the federal government starts October 1.
1 October.
And so I don't know if this is how you're looking at this person having to be funded for July 1. I mean, a couple, 3 months difference there.
Yes, sir. But I think the concern was we didn't want to get into a little too late in 22 if they were going to cut them loose at the end of 21.
Okay.
Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Brown.
Thank you. So I'm just kind of curious too, and this is probably getting way into the weeds, so I'll admit that, but is this 900 series budgeting, is this a contract that you guys initiate with these guys? Is that how this goes through?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I thought I knew the answer, but I have an expert in the room, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, follow up on that.
Yes.
So just based off of what you were saying, I don't think that this would be a line item that the tag just magically has an extra $50,000 that he just gets to have. It would be, you could dedicate it to this and then revert it back if it's not used in that year or whatever the case is. It's not like it's expendable to just go spend on anything. It can be very well tied to this exact issue.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, exactly.
Further comments from the committee? Seeing, oh, yes. Representative, or Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one more question. If these organizations are struggling, have you looked at the funding models, how they're working, maybe reworking that structure, or is that been a topic of discussion?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, if you're talking about the internal operations of the VFW and the American Legion, I only have insight into how they do as a state, what their income is, what their output is. So what their income is and what their expenditures are. I can't get that at the national level. I'm sure at the end of the year, they'll probably publish something, but it's not down to the state level. It's just the overarching budget balance sheet, so to speak. So I just don't have that insight at the national level.
Yes, Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Krivetsky, these organizations are pretty much membership-driven, life member of the DAV and VFW. Is it because that membership is falling, basically, people aren't joining, that we're having these issues?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Hutchings, I think that's part of the problem. I absolutely do. When you have the older members who are, and I'm just going to be blunt, who are passing away, you don't have enough new members that are replacing them. It's like I said, the operating model is just not the same as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when people frequented
And I think
these post homes.
When they go in front of appropriations, I think Senator Steinmetz's comment about have they look at the funding model, I think we want more sustainable funding and possibly and probably from private. If he has those kind of numbers that says, you know, they've gone from 5,000 members to 2,000 members and this is why they don't have, we may understand that better than we just want the money. Give us the money. So thank you very much for that. Now, if there's no other further comments from the committee, public comment, please. Identify yourself.
My name's Keith Davidson. I'm the current chairman of the Wyoming Veterans Commission. I'm the past state commander of the Wyoming American Legion. I'm a member of the American Legion, the VFW, the DAV. 1951, the American Legion had 10,700 members. That's a record year. In 2003, the Wyoming American Legion had something over 8,000 members. As time has gone along, after 2001, our membership in the American Legion now is something over 5,000 members. It continues to drop. The American Legion on a national level, over 4 million, 2003, under 3 million. We used to talk about when we go to Congress, so we have over 3 million members in our Legion family. Now, when they go to Congress, we have over 2 million members, American Legion family. Over the years, the state of Wyoming American Legion has continued to raise their dues to where most common posts charge $50 a year now. 10 years ago, it was $25 a year. National has raised their dues twice in the last 10 years. It's a declining membership. It's hard to keep members. We have a different climate we live in. American Legion posts used to be the center of all the neighborhoods. We have 60 American Legion posts in the state of Wyoming. About 15 of those posts have bars. The thing the American Legion raises money for is support of veterans, support of children and youth, et cetera. There's 4 main pillars of the American Legion. But the membership drops, the dues go up, and they just don't have the money to do it anymore. And that's what happened 6, 7 years ago, and that's the exact reason at that time the legislature provided money to support the American Legion and keep that function there. Right now, the VFW, the only reason they're funding their money right now at the VFW for this position is they're spending their savings. And in the year 2022, they will have no savings left, and potentially the VFW and the whole state could fold. So that's part of the problem. That's where the money's not coming from. But statewide, national-wide, all the veteran service organizations are losing membership.
Questions for Mr. Davidson? Yes, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what's the backup plan?
Come see legislature, I guess. I don't know. We recruit new members all the time, but we have members dying off all the time too. The veteran count in Wyoming 5 years ago was 56,000. We're down to 48,000 veterans in the state of Wyoming. So not only are membership, or veterans going down, membership's going down. The other thing that's happening nowadays is the cost of claims are going up. Over the last 7 years, we have a lot more claims coming in Wyoming. Colonel Konvinsky can probably give you the better number, but the amount of money we're bringing back to the state of Wyoming through these service officers and through the 3 organizations that are the review body has gone up substantially. I don't know the exact numbers, but.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, as I stated, about 1,280 claims were submitted just by our 7 state service officers last year through those 3 service organizations. Mr. Davidson is correct. We have a declining veteran population, but I will tell you the complexity and the amount of claims is going up. And then when you factor in future, what I perceive that will happen, Blue Water Navy, Vietnam veterans being service connected for Agent Orange, you're going to see a spike in claims just like we did for the Vietnam veterans who were on the ground in the Niemer case. So the complexity of claims is going to go up. We're probably going to see more money coming into the state, but that's only if we can process claims.
Further questions, comments from the committee? Yes, Representative Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the number of veterans, the total number of veterans is going down in Wyoming, or just the number that are joining the organization, or is it kind of a combination of the two? Or?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, the number of veterans in the state is declining. So a couple of years ago, we had almost 49,000. I think the latest number from the VA is 47,247. Roughly, that's ballpark. Probably I can tell you it's within 10, sir. In the declining membership of these organizations, there's a declining membership in these organizations. I'll tell you, I believe the DAV membership is going up. But the traditional American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars is going down.
Follow up. And that is, and their percentage of membership is dropping. The numbers are dropping, and then the percentage of membership is dropping. Is that what you're telling us?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, yes.
Follow up. Yes. Is there an issue with them understanding what their memberships buy and who they're supporting with this? I mean, this is an element of kind of an internal, hey, join these organizations so that we fund a position like this.
That is very true. And one place that the Legion, the VFW, does pick up membership from is when somebody submits a claim and they get awarded a claim and they get compensation, a large majority of those folks do join the VFW or the American Legion. It's the ones that aren't getting any compensation that we don't get a lot of joining from. There's some folks that get out of the military and just want to be all done with it. There's other folks that are patriotic and they want to serve the Legion and want to serve their fellow veterans. It's a tough road to get some of the younger folks to join. The one thing I can say over the years, in 1971, there was an article in one of the major newspapers that the declining organization of the American Legion, and if you read it nowadays, you would think it was today. And nowadays, those same veterans from the Vietnam era run all those organizations. As time goes along, we're going to get a lot more of the younger veterans. Right now, the young veterans are raising families, taking care of families, taking care of their jobs, working their jobs. We find the increase in the membership a lot of times comes from the Vietnam era veterans, et cetera, that are running the organizations and that are joining those organizations. The other thing that's happened over the years, no fault of the state, no fault of anybody, 40 years ago, the Department of Veterans Affairs had category 1, 2, and 3 veterans, and almost any veteran could go to the VA and be taken care of. They cut out category 3 veterans, and then along the way they came back and made priority 1 through 8 veterans. And at one time, any veteran could go in and be treated at the VA. And in 2003, they cut out all priority 8 veterans. Well, you cut out a lot of veterans. They served, but they can't go to the VA. So they therefore see the fact that the Legion, the VFW, the DAV hadn't done anything for them, so they're not going to join. It's kind of a difficult pill to swallow for an older Vietnam vet to go in and be treated for 2 or 3 years and then be told, no, you can't be treated anymore. And that was my experience. 2003, I went back and they told me, no, you can't be seen. You had a job. You have health insurance. You don't pass the means test. It wasn't until that I met a claims person that said, well, Keith, you served in Vietnam, right? And I said, yeah. He said, well, come see me. We'll put your claim in and you'll be able to be seen at the VA. But believe me, I keep my Medicare up and I keep my supplemental insurance because any day they could change their mind and say, no, you have insurance, you have Medicare, we're not going to see you anymore. And it's distrustful things like that over the years that has declined the membership of the organizations. It's not really the fault of the organization. It's really more the fault of the federal government and how they support their former soldiers. And if we can't support our former soldiers, we're not going to get new ones.
Any questions, comments from the committee? Seeing none. Ms. Davidson, do you have anything else for us?
Oh, no, thank you. I just appreciate the subcommittee support, and I really appreciate your support over the years of getting the skilled nursing facility as far as we've gotten it. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for your time.
Take that up next, actually. Any other public comment on Veterans Claim Service and Funding? Seeing none, public comments closed. Anything else, Mr. Kravinsky?
No, thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we'll move on to number 8, which is progress of veterans facilities, veterans skilled nursing facility, federal application, level 3 plan, and veterans home renovation, level 1 and 2 studies. All yours.
You just want to introduce yourself?
Ryan Scranton, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Ryan Scranton, Project Manager, State Construction Department.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee. My name is Franz Fuchs. I'm Policy Analyst with the Department of Health.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we're obviously required to give you an update on where we're at with the skilled nursing facility, and that's what I'll provide for you right now. The initial state home construction grant application, which is the very first step, was submitted on March 11th. It was due April 15th, and that was approved by the VA. So approving the initial grant application means solely that we qualify to be on the priority 1 list. That's it. It doesn't say that we're going to give you the state, the matching funds at the federal level. This is step 1 in it's a marathon, not a sprint, as I like to say. So this is step 1. The level 3 request for qualification was sent out via public purchase on 15 March of 19. 6 companies responded to that statement of qualification. On 15 April 19, 6 teams were reviewed SOQ, the selection team reviewed the statement of qualifications and selected 3 finalists on 22 April. Requests for proposals for the level 1 and 2 veterans home renovation were sent to the 3 finalists on the 22nd of April. And the desire is to have 1 company do the level 3 as well as the 1 and 2. So the RFPs went out for both. And yesterday, we conducted interviews of 3 companies, 3 finalists to be awarded the work.
So, Mr. Kravinsky, you're talking about everybody from, everything from examining the site to construction being done by 1 company.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, for the level 1 and 2, so that's to do the feasibility and reconnaissance study on the existing veterans home and what needs to be done there. And the level 3 design, engineering, architecture, and construction of the skilled nursing facility that was approved by House of Roll Act 104.
Yes. Representative Laux.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Steve, so you guys interviewed 6 companies.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux, 6 companies replied to the submitted statements of qualification. And through the process, we've narrowed that down to 3, and we've interviewed 3 companies yesterday, sir.
So, Mr. Chairman, Steve, my question will be the same as always. So are there any Wyoming companies in those 3 that you looked at, Wyoming-owned companies?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Laux, yes, there are.
More than one of the 3 or all 3?
I would say 2 of the 3.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Pappas.
in light of Senate File 74, this is federal money, and we can't put those kind of requirements on this particular requirement. I don't know if that's where you were going.
Representative Laux.
No, Mr. Chairman, in answer to the senator's question, yes, I understand that federal funding, there's not a preference, nothing can be done there. I understand the process very well. Just hoping that we're trying to use Wyoming companies wherever we can to qualify. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Pappas.
You've selected the designer now?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Pappas, we did the interviews yesterday. We have not yet collected and reviewed all the committee members the selection committee members' documentation yet to announce who the final company will be.
Mr. Kravinsky.
So we interviewed the 3 companies, as I stated yesterday, sir. The next required document to go to the Department of Veterans Affairs for the State Home Construction Grant Program is the proof of state matching funds. It's called the DD Form 10-0388-6. We have submitted that. And we submitted a copy of House Enrolled Act 104 to show what exactly the state required to make sure we've met all the requirements. So that's not due until August 1st. That is already submitted. So the next step now is to actually start the level 3 work in methodically going through what the requirements are as we're going through this study. Because the initial grant paperwork, I will tell you, for an initial grant, it was very, very time-consuming, very detailed, and the VA forms don't. The VA would ask you to fill out a certain form and then require documentation, and if they're incongruent by VA rules, so we had to work through some of that. And I think it's going to be even worse when we get to the final application. So our goal is to submit that final application. It's due in June of 2020. We want to have that submitted at least 45 days with the slimmest margin of 30 days so we can work those nuances with the VA. We were very successful in the methodology we used this time. They gave us credit for the day we submitted the application. Told us, say, if we find something after the deadline, we'll allow it. We've adjudicated everything, and we've received approval. So that is the status update where we are today. Today, Mr. Chairman, when we go to the Buffalo home, we can obviously look at the old soldiers and sailors home, and we could point out several locations in which the companies thought it would be a good place to put it, but that won't be finalized until we do the level 3 work on exactly where the X on the ground is going to be. But there's a lot of things being considered: water pipes, electrical coming in, view shed, and there's several different items.
Mr. Chairman. Yes. Does the schedule for design, is it contemplating a spring construction of 2020?
So, go ahead, Ryan.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, as we move forward with the schedule for the grant application as well as the design, we will find out on the final application December of 2020-ish, potentially January, February 21. So ideally, we would go out for bid early 21 and then start construction spring of 21.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Pappas, sir, I did do a timeline. I apologize for the way it printed out, but if you want, I can just briefly hit where we're at today and where we need to go.
Next page.
So if you look at the bottom, the state proof of 35% matching funds, so there's two timelines, the upper and the lower. So I'm in the August state proof of matching, 35% matching funds. That's our next gate we have to hit with the VA. We have already met that obligation. October, the level 3 design will start sometime between now and the next 30 days. That'll go on through April of 2020. The final VA grant application is due in June of 2020. We should find out at the end of 2020, early 2021. They say that they release it in December of 2020. I will tell you that the list for this year came out probably February. And then we'll work to get the actual construction on contract.
Mr. Chairman, so by time the design is complete, which is mid-2020, correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, correct.
And then we get approval and actually bid it in early spring of 2021. That's a full year that design is going to sit on the shelf. It's going to be critical to have a decent contingency, because I know full well designing a project a year before and then trying to go out to bid, that those construction cost estimates get, so it's problematic when the designer does a cost estimate and then you wait a year to bid it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, I completely agree with that. The VA allows for a 5% contingency, nothing more for that. So we also built that in to the construction costs.
So the state is putting in 15 million? Is that what the loan is?
No, Mr. Chairman, not up to 9 million, not to exceed 35% of the construction cost. So there's two caveats in there. We believe we'll only need.
It's up to 9?
Up
max.
to 9 max.
Okay.
Or not to exceed 35% of the construction cost. So hypothetically, if the construction cost was 20 million, we couldn't exceed 7 million.
Okay. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, one of the issues with that site was the water, and you're building 2 new buildings. Do you think you'll need to put in a little bigger water line? And if so, will you charge that off to the veterans home as opposed to the skilled nursing facility?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, what we've got from the civil engineers thus far is yes, the capacity on an existing line is not adequate. We will have to put in a larger line for domestic as well as fire suppression. And I would suggest that that gets charged to the skilled nursing facility based on the unknown moving forward with the vets home. The funding has not been approved for the vets home at this point. And that water line will be needed for the skilled nursing facility.
Thank you. Mr. Kravinsky, more?
Mr. Chairman, just a couple of final notes. So the VA State Home Construction Grant Program about 2 weeks ago announced what their funding would be for 2020. The expectation was that they would do $100 million in grants. It turned out to be 150. So average over the past few years has been anywhere from about 98,000, 92 to 98,000. There was 1 year that was a blip. They put in 700 million, but that was to clear out the list of projects that had been sitting there for years. So hope is not a plan, but in 2021, that's the federal fiscal year in which these funds will be allocated to our project. If it's around 150 million again, I'm pretty hopeful. I don't want to say confident, but I will tell you the VA State Home Construction Grant Program is very excited about this project. And it's because of the design we're using, the small home project. So that's some of the conversations we have with the VA. They've been very supportive of us in the state. And subject to your question, sir, that's really all I have.
Comments on the skilled, yes, Representative Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The comment here that desires to have one company accomplish both, is that a hope or an actionable plan, or what does that sentence mean?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, when we interviewed the companies, we put that in, well, the construction department put that in for the request for proposals. They will do, what we're looking for is a holistic view. If you have a level 1 and 2 study and you don't, for the veterans home, and you don't connect that to what we're doing for the skilled nursing, we think that you might miss or cost more in the long run. So we have one company who we would decide upon, and we'll get the work for both. The level 1 and 2 reconnaissance and feasibility study on the veterans home as it exists today. You know, what is that going to look like in the future? Is it going to be more cottages? Is it going to be renovating the building? Is it going to be tearing it down and building another institutional type building or cottages? But we thought that there was some synergies between using the same company to look at both. And that is actionable, and it's complete. If that answers your question, sir.
Further comments, questions? Representative Lopez.
Mr. Chairman, Steve, as the process, and thanks for explaining it, so there's $150 million is budgeted for the whole nation for any capital expenditures on not just skilled nursing, but other projects as well. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux, that's absolutely correct. So hypothetically, I have a 300-bed unit in Texas, and it's damaged by a storm or a hurricane. That's a life safety. That's going to score
priority.
very, very high, and that's going to eat into that $150 million.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Is there, and during that process of their decision-making, through a board or whatever, is there public input in that? Is there public comment?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Laux, no, this is done at the federal level. It's all predicated on the information we submit in the final application. And I believe Secretary Wilkie, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, is the final approval authority based on a recommendation from Ms. Anna Gogg, who is the Director of the State Home Construction Grant Program.
Thank you very much for helping me a lot.
Any other further comments? Any questions? Mr. Gravinsky had to do with skilled nursing. And so what can you tell us about going over to Buffalo today? What are we going to see?
Mr. Chairman, I'll defer that to the Health Department representative who actually owns that facility.
Mr. Fuchs?
Mr. Chairman, again, my name is Franz Fuchs, Policy Analyst, Department of Health. Our facility administrator is standing by for the tour. What you will see is some very nice grounds. You'll see the bighorns, and you'll see sort of travel back through time as the various, 40s wing, the 60s wing, the 70s wing. It's you get to see the architectural styles of those eras on full display.
So this will be when we go over to Buffalo. This will be the soldier, well, what we used to call the soldier and sailor home.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Does everybody know where that is, by the way? Yeah, it's on the way to the.
I think it's over 16.
It's at 16. I can never remember the route numbers because I don't look.
Going over to Tensley.
It's like you're going to the Bighorns, or you're going over the Bighorns, so it's right there on the left. It'll be just out of Buffalo, about a
Veterans
mile,
Lane.
2 miles out of Buffalo. It'll be on the left. It'll have a sign that says Veterans Home. They did change the sign, didn't they, from the old sailors, soldiers and sailors?
They used to have a veteran up there in a wheelchair. People going by.
Yeah, he might be out there today, and we never know.
So
Take a left at the.
Mr. Chairman, what you can also expect to see is some great veterans who served our country, and you will see, hopefully, Miss Lisa Griffith will be there. She does an amazing job helping our veterans with their claims work, and she's just absolutely amazing. So if you see her, please say hello to her.
And you won't be joining us?
Mr. Chairman, I'll absolutely be there.
Okay.
I didn't think I had a choice.
Sure, we all have a choice, except when you get stationed somewhere else. Committee directives, I think we're at that point. Committee directives. Ms. Jarvis, do you have what we need to have bills written on, which I think is 2 of the items?
Mr. Chairman, what we have in the ongoing list at the moment is to work with the military department regarding Harvey Packard exemption documents that might be required. LSO to draft a bill regarding the state security officers. To work with the military department, thanks. To work with the military department regarding the Starbase, Wyoming Cowboy Challenge Academy, nonprofits accepting donations. And
we want to include all the various, so if we can make it a
nonprofits.
single statute that says when equipment or something changes hands, it belongs to whoever receives it, the Wyoming Military Department. We want them to be able to accept whether it's the Starbase Academy or the Challenge Academy or it's any of those.
Or a future nonprofit or
Right,
organization.
Exactly.
Yes, that is noted. Thank you. And the military department is compiling, together with the various other licensing organizations who are here, a report regarding licensing from the questionnaire that they will yet to work out. There are several items that were requested regarding the Veterans Claims Service numbers, which I believe the military department has recorded. And that is the list that I've compiled at this point.
Anybody else in the committee have anything else they would like to add to that, or it seems like you caught it. Thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other, anything else for the committee, actually?
I might have missed it. Are we going to work on that officer? I was doing too much reading and not listening well enough. Are we going to work on the department service officer that they're losing as part of an interim?
The 50,000 would be a budget item.
My understanding, Mr. Chairman, but please direct differently so that I can have a full, better, complete understanding, was that the Veterans Commission was going to respond to the committee with some additional numbers before, and that there's not a further item beyond that as far as drafting a bill at this point.
All right.
Is that correct?
And that is correct, and what basically the general is going to go in front of the Appropriations Committee and ask for the additional money. How it gets dispensed or when it gets dispensed is not the issue. It's if they are opposed to that idea, then it'll have to be a personal bill this time, and it possibly could be a committee bill a year later, at this point anyway. Other than that, do you have anything else, Heather?
Mr. Chairman, there may be some logistics as far as travel to Buffalo. I know, or I believe that it was both the chairman's intent for folks to carpool as much as possible. Each of you has volunteered that you have, I think, 4 seats in your vehicles. And I know that there are more or less 3 tours that we have in front of us. There's what's continually referred to as the Soldiers and Sailors Home. There's the potential location for the Veteran Skilled Nursing Facility. And then to kind of shift gears towards tomorrow is to go to the groundbreaking for the Wyolink Tower. You all the committee received the invitation and the directions for the Wyolink Tower that where we will go after we have spent time and had plenty of room for questions and touring around the veterans facilities.
So does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, Ms. Representative Western. Actually, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, so how about we meet, it takes you about an hour to get there. So we meet at 2 o'clock, which will give you about 45 minutes from right now before you have to start driving. So how about 2 o'clock over at the old the Veterans Home in Buffalo? Does that work? Okay, 2 o'clock over there, please. Yes. We'll be back tomorrow. I don't know if they're going to lock this room up or not, or...
Mr. Chairman, it would be wise for you to take your laptops or electronic devices, whatever you wish. But we do intend for this building to be locked. We'll double check that, but
Okay.
take with you what you wish.
Do you know if that cafe's open by the chance?
We don't know yet, but if you move very slowly, we'll try to find an answer before you leave this room.
Okay. There you are.
2 o'clock
Yeah. Yeah, I need to find somebody that may want to ride with.
Yeah.
I can drive if somebody wants to, or I can jump in somebody else.
Sandy?
I
Okay, 2.
have room for.
Anybody want to go with the chairman here?
Yeah,
One of us?
I got room for 3. You're coming? Okay, Tom's coming.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that, that's a great place too. I'm probably gonna go.
I gotta figure out where we're gonna go.